Chapter 276. On the red team's platform, Dake narrowed his eyes slightly, feeling the joy of victory. Although this duel didn't last long, it had consumed a lot of his spirit. However, the roars that were like a tsunami made him slightly excited. Is this a duel? A thrilling and exciting duel, a hearty victory. It made him recognize what a duel was once again. People could be indifferent, but they couldn't be without desires. The newcomer competition had given him a new perspective on duels. He didn't look at the audience immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly and looked at Elsie Kevin opposite him. This senior Kevin was really a good opponent. Website. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. It would be great if he had the chance to fight again. Elsie Kevin picked up the magic card and stood up, just in time to meet Dake's gaze. He subconsciously took a deep breath. The emotions that he had lost control of just now had been adjusted with the passage of time. He took out the magic card and put away the remaining mechanical components in the arena. If it was a duel, there would be victory and defeat. It wasn't the first time he had failed. The reason why he had lost his composure at the end of today's duel, apart from the fact that his opponent was a first year, was mainly because the duel was too intense and had made him too engrossed. Once a person was too engrossed, it was not easy to control their emotions. After sorting out his emotions again, he looked at Dake and said, "First, I lost." Dake nodded slightly. "Thank you for letting me win." Their voices were covered by the shouts that hadn't subsided yet. It was only to the extent that both sides could barely hear each other. Although it was only a simple exchange of words, both sides had a good impression of each other. The two of them greeted each other again, and then looked away. Dake picked up the magic card and put away the big milk can in the arena. Then he began to replenish his magic one by one. The fusion time limit of the Basti Beast hadn't passed yet. He hadn't mastered the fusion removal technique. At that moment, Dake began to look below the stage. He first saw the three people led by the Valkyrie, then raised his hand and waved at Arvette. Arvette's eyes lit up, and she quickly raised her hand and waved fiercely. The eldest princess didn't stop her this time. She could understand the Valkyrie's excitement. Dark shifted his gaze slightly and looked at Claire, who was beside him. Claire raised Galileo's paw and waved it at him. Dake couldn't help but laugh. This cat was still so fat. Then he retracted his gaze and looked around the ring. He caught sight of Diana, Luosi and Panduola and stopped looking. After all, he still had to continue in the next match, and he couldn't keep occupying the contestant platform. When he walked down from the contestant platform, the Basti Beast came to his side with light steps. "Let's go," Dake said softly. The Basti Beast followed him all the way into the contestants' tunnel. Charlotte waved at him and congratulated. "I didn't expect you to win." Dake smiled and said, "Luck, I guess." Then he greeted White, who was waiting at the entrance. "Hi God. Are you in the next match?" White's smile was a little bitter, but he still replied, "Yes, I am." Dake said politely, "Do your best." "White. Thank you." White Gouda walked out of the contestant tunnel and walked to the red contestant platform. He didn't look very energetic from the back. Dake asked curiously, "What's wrong with him?" Demi Charlotte shook her head slightly and said, "Maybe he's under too much pressure." Dake thought about White's situation and agreed. Maybe. Sometimes, bearing the weight of too many people's expectations was actually a very difficult thing. Fortunately, his own pressure came from within. No one gave him excessive expectations. Forget it. He turned and walked into the tunnel, but he didn't return to the contestant lounge. Instead, he turned to another tunnel that led to the ring. When there was no one around, he said to the Basti Beast, "Thank you for your hard work today." But the Basti Beast didn't respond. Dake subconsciously turned his head to look. Suddenly, a hint of musk entered his nose. Before he could turn his head, he felt a slight itch on his neck. It was the feeling of hair tickling his skin. Two delicate arms took the opportunity to surround him and wrap around his neck. A breath like orchids blew into his other ear, making him feel a little uncomfortable. "Stop messing around," Dake said helplessly. So after he mastered fusion, the number of times he summoned the Basti Beast could be counted on one hand, because it was too difficult to deal with. Meow Heartsuit. the Basti beast naturally wouldn't be affected by such a soft command. Dake reached out and grabbed one of its tails. Then he grabbed the tip of the tail and gave it a hard tug. The Basti beast was like a cat that had been grabbed by the back of its neck. It instantly softened. Dake casually threw it away, looking like he didn't want to admit his mistake. He straightened his collar and said proudly, "I'm going out. Remember not to expose yourself." Okay. The Basti beast followed behind him like a little wife who had been wronged. When the sun shone, the man and the pet had already walked out of the passage. Dake searched his memory and found the corner where Senior Panduola was. He sat down beside her very naturally, attracting a lot of attention. "Senior, how was it?" Dake asked. Panduola glanced at the Basti beast beside Dake in an extremely obscure manner and said, "Is this the result of fusion?" Dake nodded. "If it wasn't for fusion today, I really don't know what the outcome would have been. Senior Kevin is really a strong opponent." Panduola smiled. "You just haven't accumulated enough." By this time next year, his level. Dake blinked, confirming that he had heard something from Senior Panduola. He said, "I heard that in the previous batch of first years, almost no one could join the duel club in advance." Panduola: "I don't pay much attention to that. However, there are only a few second-year students who are worth watching this year." "Well, Elsie Kevin can barely be considered one of them." She spoke very deliberately. However, Dake suspected that it wasn't that the second-year students weren't good enough, but that her standards were too high. Beep! The whistle sounded. The 11th duel of the morning had begun. Dake whispered something to Senior Panduola, and then left from the back. Today was a rare day. He wanted to be closer to his family. The height difference between the spectator seats and the ring was only 1 meter, but the distance between the two was more than 3 meters. There was a buffer zone in the middle. Because the audience couldn't actually reach the ring from the spectator seats, there were no protective barriers or other things in between. However, the students couldn't go to the spectator seats either, so they couldn't communicate very well. It was just that they could see the spectator seats from the ring. However, they couldn't see the ring from the spectator seats. This was a measure to protect the privacy of the students. Dake walked to the ring closest to Arvet and found a seat to sit down. Accompanied by the Basti beast, he silently replenished the magic of the magic elves. People had to be able to withstand popularity and cold treatment. Of course, he wouldn't act like a child and act coquettishly with his mother. Just being closer to her could make his mood gradually ease. He indeed didn't have any external pressure. However, the internal pressure wasn't something that ordinary people could compare to. He put down his thoughts and carefully felt it. The winter temperature seemed to have warmed up. About 3 meters behind him, Arvet didn't know that her baby was sitting in front of her. She only had the mentality of a parent watching a child's performance. After watching the performance, since she couldn't have further contact with her child, she would just go back. However, the first princess pulled her back helplessly. "Let's wait until White Gouda's competition before leaving." God. Arvet couldn't help but think of the mischievous god. Because the battlefront was different, her memories of Brett God only stopped at the time when she was a student, and the final Demon King crusade. As for the rest, she didn't know much. In fact, her relationship with Brett God wasn't particularly good. At most, they were members of the same club. Arvet thought for a moment and said, "God's family is indeed prone to producing heroes, but what evidence can prove that White Gouda is a future hero? Just based on that useless holy sword curse?" First Princess Elisha said, "It's a prophecy. The deputy castellan of Sky City, Granny Maggie of No Way Forest, made a prophecy about this. White Gouda will be a hero. When the world is in danger again, he will step forward bravely, just like his father." Arvet shook her head. "Of course I know that. But if the prophecy is really so accurate, he wouldn't have sacrificed so much in the battle with the demons." Elisha: "Although I think so too, it's better to believe it than not. We all know that this world isn't actually safe." Arvet sighed. "That's why I don't want to continue with internal friction." On the other side, Prince Charles and the Archbishop had finally met the hero they had been waiting for. The hero had always been favored by the light, and had a good relationship with the Holy Church, so the relationship between the two sides was generally not bad. The previous batch of heroes also received support from the Holy Church at the beginning of their graduation. It was only later that they fell out because of something, but it wasn't to the extent that it couldn't be resolved. At least, that was what the Holy Church thought. They came this time to see the talent potential of the hero. On the other hand, they wanted to observe the character of the hero. Only by understanding a person as much as possible could they make targeted strategies. Whether it was for the sake of righteousness or ZZ factor, they needed to be prepared. On this point, they actually had the same idea as the first princess. He's finally here. Is this the future hero? As White Gouda stepped onto the contestant platform, the first prince couldn't help but become serious. Just from his appearance alone, Victor seemed to fit the impression that Bravehearts always gave people. That kind of natural affinity made it easier for people to trust him. Moreover, he really looks like the previous hero. After careful observation, the first prince couldn't help but think, I wonder how he compares to the son of the Valkyrie. White Gouda stood on the red team platform and looked down. He found Luobot and some of his classmates from the Knight Academy. Since the astronomy class, his classmates' attitude toward him had improved a lot. There were also many people cheering for him. But he really didn't have much confidence. Especially after watching the entire duel between Dirk and Kevin, he was once again deeply aware of the gap between the two of them. If his opponent was like Elsie Kevin, he felt that he should just admit defeat. Fortunately, it wasn't. On the commentary platform, Wilson sipped his tea and began the round of commentary without stopping. Without the constraints of the society, his commentary was more relaxed. White Gouda, one of the 7 people who joined the duel club early this year, known as Lucky Gouda, is the son of the hero. Wilson almost roared the end of his speech. But the audience didn't seem to have switched over from the previous duel, so he had to say it again. He's also a first year. After the son of the Valkyrie, the son of the hero is closely following. Both of them are the descendants of the kingdom's twin swords, and they are both promising newcomers. Presumably, White Gouda won't be inferior to Dake Dimung. He can also bring us a wonderful duel. What I'm worried about now is whether his opponent can make him show his true strength. Then let's welcome the blue team's contestant, David Leonard. Leonard is a second year's top student, and he successfully joined the duel club last semester. By the way, he is also a member of the Knight Academy. First year versus second year, the internal battle of the Knight Academy, a competition between bravery and bravery. With Wilson's efforts, the audience's attention was finally pulled back. People suddenly realized that the black-haired boy on the stage was the rumored son of the hero. So the atmosphere was finally livened up. And the competition also began at this time. David Leonard was a second-year student of the Knight Academy. Like most of the Knight Academy students, he was happy that the son of the hero had entered the Knight Academy at the beginning of school. But after school started, he gradually stopped paying attention to him like most of the Knight Academy students. After all, the Shungmalian studies weren't easy, and they didn't have much energy to pay attention to a first-year student for a long time. As for the things that happened to the son of the hero, naturally, they had heard of it. As the son of the hero, it seemed very normal to be at the center of the incident. Moreover, White's results in the Halloween event were actually quite good. This time, he had also successfully joined the duel club. Compared to the average student, he was already very good. Most people just lowered their attention to him and didn't do anything else. This time, David Leonard was a little excited to be the opponent of White Gouda. He boasted that he was about to become the touchstone of the hero, and that even if he lost, he wouldn't lose face. But their previous duel had pulled the upper limit of the standard too high. Leonard knew that he definitely couldn't play the role of Elsie Kevin. At least, he only had 2 second-tier magic elves in his hands, similar to Deanna's opponent. It would be a pity if he couldn't let the son of the hero play to his heart's content, because his level was too low. But since things had come to this, he could only bite the bullet and walk onto the stage of the duel. Preparation stage, 30s. The panel on the table showed the countdown of the preparation stage. The 2 people who didn't have much confidence drew cards at the same time. After the first 5 cards, White quickly glanced at them. Troll. He was suddenly happy. Starting with Troll was a very common scene in the duel competition. After all, it belonged to the popular card series. With 1,500 attack and 1,400 defense, it was ranked at the top of the 3-star magic elves. Therefore, when the battle stage began, White immediately summoned Troll. The Troll, which was as strong as a hill, appeared with a roar. Except for its ugly appearance, it really didn't have many shortcomings. Only the Archbishop frowned slightly. Why is it a troll? Even if it wasn't a light-type magic elf like the Diru beast, it shouldn't be a troll, right? But then, White summoned the 2-star two-headed ogre. If there had to be a classification then, White's card deck at this time was actually more inclined towards the Underground Monster series. That obviously wouldn't be in line with the aesthetics of an Archbishop. In contrast, the Paladin, Je and Paladin Shwe that David Leonard summoned had the characteristics of the Holy Church. The two paladins that were almost identical would trigger the halo called Philosophy when they appeared at the same time. Within the range of the Philosophy halo, the Paladin series magic elves would receive 100 points of magic power bonus. Among the 3 bonuses, the magic power bonus was usually considered inferior to the attack bonus and defense bonus. However, the Paladin series magic cards were generally very lacking in magic power. With the Philosophy halo, it could slightly make up for this flaw. Moreover, David Leonard's Paladin series was mainly a combination of halos. Through the stacking of different halos, the power of the Paladins would be increased more evenly, thus winning the group battle. Generally, this was David Leonard's tactical system. Paladin, Je and Paladin Shwe were both 3-star magic elves, but except for defense, their 3 attributes were inferior to White's Troll. Therefore, at the beginning of the duel, David Leonard was slightly at a disadvantage. But at the beginning of the second round, David Leonard summoned Paladin, Wind and Paladin Fury. The combination of the Storm, Halo gave all the Paladin series magic elves a 100-point attack bonus. The situation began to slowly reverse. In the third round, David Leonard summoned Paladin Fury. The Fury, halo formed by the combination of Paladin, Fury, and Paladin. Fury gave all the Paladin series magic elves another 100-point attack bonus. Therefore, the team of 6 Paladins defeated White's Troll. Even if the Troll used Sacrificial Charge, it only replaced 1 Paladin. But it was not a big deal. White relied on the rest of the magic elves to barely hold on. In the 5th round he finally had Taboo Love and Luminous Python in his hands. The appearance of Luminous Python made the Archbishop, whose face was as gloomy as water, finally regain a little patience. After all, it was of the light attribute. However, even the Troll was besieged by the Paladin group, so the Luminous Python naturally could not hold the fort alone. White relied on the Luminous Python's large-scale killing skill, Sacred Light, to barely kill 2 2-star Paladins before he was besieged and killed. The 6th round, White used Taboo Love to make Paladin Je turn against him and obtain a certain result. He also struggled to survive this round. However, because there was no stronger magic card, even if he survived this round, he could not see his future. He was just muddling through. Due to the restraint in his hands, he was unable to refine a new magic card this week. His research on the Holy Sword Curse was still in the early stages. Most of his time was spent on schoolwork and the occasional relaxing magic chess. The Knight Academy did not have teacher Dake Diming's after-class teaching. The math test paper stumped most of the first-year students of the Knight Academy who were not so smart. The duel ended. David Leonard sighed as he looked at the 2 4-star magic guide fairies in his hand. He could have sacrificed and summoned the 4-star magic elves in the first few rounds to complete the crushing. However, he did not do that in the end. Instead, he only relied on the stacking of the first-tier magic elves halo to duel until now. At first, he was worried that his level was not enough to be the touchstone of the Hero Sun. He did not expect the Hero Sun's level to be lower than he expected. No. He was afraid that the previous Dake Dimming had suddenly raised his expectations of the Hero Sun. In fact, White's level was still above average. It was just that it was not outstanding. After all, He was only a first-year student who had been enrolled for half a year. He could not ask for too much. Moreover, he heard that Brett the hero was not a top student with good grades when he was a student. Perhaps the hero legacy was the same as the Fool's Academy, where it only showed its strength in the later stages. David Leonard found a reason for White as he won the match easily and won. When the referee blew the whistle and announced his victory, scattered applause could be heard from outside the venue. He suddenly felt a burst of dullness. In the audience, the seats where eldest Prince Charles and the Archbishop were originally sitting were quietly emptied. Of course, they would not arbitrarily deny a person based on his performance in the newcomers' competition. However, they might have to adjust their previously formulated plan slightly. Eldest Princess Elisha and Valkyrie Yvette did not leave the arena. Yvette was very clear about the previous hero son's character when he was a student. Therefore, she was already used to it. As the saying goes, the son inherits the father's medicine. At least this year's hero son did not seem to be so terrible. The eldest princess was seriously considering whether to continue competing with the Holy Church for the support of the hero son. Or should she simply shift the focus of the faction to the Valkyrie's son? 3-in-1. It's December, please vote. Chapter 277. This rookie competition might not make them change their intentions immediately, but it would more or less have some impact. And most of the time, the final change in direction was due to such factors. It was accumulated bit by bit. The reason why the son of the Braveheart was valued by people, other than the frequent appearance of various true or false prophecies, was that he was under the shadow of his father. Braveheart, Brett God and Valkyrie Yvette St. Dimming were known as the kingdom's twin swords. But the reputation of the Braveheart among the people was actually higher than that of the Valkyrie. On the one hand, it was because the word Braveheart was propagated, and on the other hand, it was because the Braveheart sacrificed himself in the end. Regardless of the era, the people would always have more respect for the sacrifice. Yvette's reputation was inferior to Brett's precisely because she was still alive. And if the son of the Braveheart could also become a Braveheart, he would inherit the reputation of the previous generation of Bravehearts and become a dragon. Remember the URL, MVIP, can't you? 6. Therefore, the importance of the son of the Braveheart was undeniable. And at this moment, even though the son of the Braveheart's defeat was foreseeable, he still felt abnormally disappointed. He could feel that the audience had high hopes for him. Unfortunately, he could not respond to their expectations. He could only grit his teeth and think that he would definitely win the next time. When he came down from the contestant stage, White completed the exchange with the next contestant. That contestant was a second-year senior. His gaze did not contain ridicule, but was filled with sympathy. It seemed like a senior from the Knight Institute patted his shoulder and consoled him. It's not embarrassing to lose to David. But was it really not embarrassing? It could only be said that the wise and the benevolent had different views. White was dispirited in the common lounge for a long time until Luo Boat came looking for him. Didn't Doran and Justin also lose? Luo Boat's consolation was more direct than the seniors. White thought carefully and felt that this was the case, so he let it go. It was Dake's victory that gave him too much of an impact. If it was a goal, he would not be willing to accept the normal failure. As for what the audience outside the arena thought, and whether they would say some irrational things after their expectations were dashed, it didn't matter much. The Shung Malian Society was a protective blanket for the baby. As long as he did not read the newspaper, he would not be affected. After the White event, the competition continued as usual. In the 13th match at 10 o'clock, another first-year student took the stage under the watchful eyes of the crowd. Ai Mortis gritted his teeth slightly. After the start of the match, he used the Gold Beast as the main axis and launched a series of attacks and defenses. However, the second-year senior opposite her seemed to have done some research on her. She used a method that completely countered her and destroyed her lineup. A crushing defeat. It was an expected defeat. It was unexpectedly miserable. Without a second-tier magic guide sprite, they would be at a huge disadvantage when fighting against the first-year students. Ai Ma summed up the experience and learned from it. After exiting the arena, He took advantage of the fact that his memory was still intact to record the entire duel. He planned to write a detailed analysis report with this as the theme. Then it was the 16th match at 10:30. Saraswati skillfully used the Sphinx Cat and sealed the opponent's offering with the sure kill skill Shadow Stomp. In the end, she became the third first-year rookie to win. When the referee blew the whistle and announced the results, she waved her hand at the cheering audience and looked at the golden-haired youth in the ring as if to say, "I did it too." Humans could only move forward when they had something to pursue. Saraswati's victory was not a fluke, but the crystallization of wisdom and hard work. Professor Cheong-si, who was in the ring, nodded in satisfaction. The competition for the 7 rookies came to an end. Actually, the victory of 3 students had already made her feel very surprised. This should have been a first battle with a purpose to polish them, to let the students know that failure was equally precious. Thus, it would have a positive effect. But now, it seemed that the victories of some people seemed to have a better motivational effect. It was still all right. It was not until Saraswati's match ended that the first-year students suddenly recalled that today's rookie competition was actually a topic for everyone. They still needed to use one of the matches as a goal to analyze and summarize it. Then which match should he aim for? Psychologically speaking, there were definitely many people who wanted to use the most exciting match as a goal to analyze and summarize it. But after careful consideration, they might choose another goal. After all, the most exciting match was also the longest and the most difficult to analyze. On the other hand, the other matches had obvious highlights and were not long. They were very friendly to the little sorcerers who focused on completing their homework. One of the most typical examples was Saraswati's match. Restricting the opponent's offering to prevent the opponent's summoning was a very effective tactic, whether it was in a competition or in actual combat. For the first-year students who lacked a high-star magic elf, it was also a way to win. Perhaps there would be topics like, what should I do if I can't summon a high-star magic elf? In short, from 11 o'clock, the first-year students left one after another. At 11:30, the eldest princess and the others also left the auditorium. Although the rookie competition was not over yet, it was no longer a rookie competition for the first-year students. Dake met up with Deanna and Luosi at around 11:10, and then went to Traveler's Street to celebrate. While the memory was still fresh, they went to the library in the afternoon to start writing. Dake and Deanna both analyzed and summarized their own matches. Luosi chose to analyze Dake's match, which was more difficult. While analyzing, he would ask Dake questions from time to time, and Dake would answer them one by one. The learning atmosphere gradually thickened. The whole afternoon passed in a busy state. Dake, who had finished all his homework for the week, finally began to seriously think about the creation of the Sure Kill skill card. Perhaps to others the use of the Sure Kill skill card was limited, but to him, the Sure Kill skill card was obviously very useful. It could replace the spell card, to a certain extent. And the method of creating the Sure Kill skill card, in addition to the basic steps, the most important point was actually to choose a magic elf card as the target. This was because the so-called Sure Kill skill card was essentially a Sure Kill skill extracted from the magic elf card. Generally speaking, it would be a Sure Kill skill that was already in the magic elf card. If he could dig deeper, he might be able to dig out the Sure Kill skill that could be learned but had not been mastered. For example, Kettle. 99% of the Kettle cards were either white or blue cards. Even if it was a blue card, there was only one Sure Kill skill, Sturdy. If he used the blue Kettle as the target, the prerequisite was that he succeeded. He would most likely be able to extract the Sure Kill skill, Sturdy. However, the magic elf that could use this Sure Kill skill, Sturdy, could only be a magic elf that had the potential to learn this Sure Kill skill. If he were to dig deeper, there was a very low probability of extracting the 3 godly skills: equal distribution of power, power trick, and equal distribution of defense. This way, he could make up for the shortcomings of the blue Kettle. Therefore, the Sure Kill skill card had a certain use value, but the application conditions were more stringent. Dake had not thought of which Sure Kill skill to extract as the target. However, unlike most students who did not know the use of that Sure Kill skill, He had too many targets to choose from, so he could not make a decision. Therefore, he planned to spend the whole night thinking about it and go to Traveler's Street to buy materials tomorrow. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Deanna and Luosi had also finished their homework, and the two of them began to think about the Surekill skill that they wanted to extract. Deanna tilted her head and asked, "Can bear bond be extracted? Can it be used on other bears after it is extracted?" Dake shook his head blankly, indicating that he did not know. Luosi wanted to extract the Surekill skill of a magic elf called Aurora Moonrabbit, Moon Palace Chariot. The reason was that the cooldown of this Surekill skill was too long, a full 24 hours. Dake did not know that she had such a magic elf until now, and he was shocked at that time. Aurora Moonrabbit was a magic elf that was very popular with women, and had once reached the top of the Magic Elf Beauty Contest. Legend had it that the Aurora Moonrabbit came from the moon, and was the pet of a certain moon god. It was born with the aurora, and the 7-colored ribbon wrapped around its body was condensed from the aurora. Just by waving the ribbon, it could create an aurora that was like a dream. The Aurora Moonrabbit had a rare Surekill skill and could transform into a beauty on the moon. However, Luosi's Aurora Moonrabbit had another skill, Moon Palace Chariot. It was a kind of aurora illusion like a mirage. It transformed into a huge and gorgeous Moon Palace chariot in the air, which was the legendary Moon Palace. Not only was it majestic and beautiful to the extreme, but it also had a miraculous effect on a moonlit night, causing the lives within the range of the Moon Palace chariot to receive a charm bonus and healing bonus. If it was a full moon night, it could even release healing light waves, which was an extremely powerful large-scale healing skill. In short, even if those special effects were excluded, just the ability to transform into a moon palace was enough to make Moon Palace Chariot a godly skill that everyone pursued. Dake suddenly realized the other function of the Surekill skill card was probably to refresh the cooldown. Some Surekill skills with a long cooldown could be completely skipped by refining a Surekill skill card. Cousin is getting married on the 5th. The update time until the 5th will be quite unstable, but it won't stop. If it's late, it'll be filled. If it's empty, it'll explode. In addition, according to the protagonist's current magic elf, which Surekill skills can be used or have special value? Let's brainstorm. I hope we can get an idea before the next chapter. Omega? Chapter 278. Of course, something like a Surekill skill was definitely not something that could be extracted just because one wanted to. Even Professor Kazair, who taught them this technology, was unable to explain the key factors that determined the success rate. Deanna wanted to extract Bear's Bond. Luosi wanted to extract Moon's Palace. However, the probability of them succeeding was actually very low. After Dake thought about it carefully, he finally had some ideas. The magic guide sprites in his hands were generally divided into two systems. The first came from Digimon. The second type originated from Pokemon. As for Trash Slime, that was an unexpected product. The Digimon's Surekill skills were very few in common, and their versatility was very low. 1 second to remember https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. Moreover, the Digimon in his hands were actually the Little Devil Beast and the Diru Beast. The other 7 belonged to the Pokemon series. Therefore, it was more appropriate to set the extraction target of the Surekill skill card within the Pokemon series. Among the Surekill skills that Pokemon could learn, there were some skills that were extremely versatile. Basically, other than a few types of Pokemon, they could learn all of them. Dake called them universal skills. Of course, his understanding of Pokemon was actually quite limited. Currently, after thinking about it, he could only think of 2 skills. One was rotation. The other was guard. These 2 Surekill skills were skills that the other 6 Pokemon could learn except for the 100 Faces monster. Among them, rotation was a team-type attack skill. It could attack the opponent through singing. If a companion used the rotation skill, not only could it be instantaneously cast, but its power would also double. From the originally inconspicuous 60, it would directly double to 120. After that, every companion would use rotation, and its power would be 120. As for the power of 120, let's give a simple example. 100,000 volts power was 90. Sunlight's power was 120. Death ray's power was 150. Moreover, rotation could also ignore skills like substitute puppets. If rotation was a sound wave skill that was quite versatile, then the other skill, defend, was a genuine godly skill. Using guard could completely block the enemy's attack. In addition to continuous use, the success rate of each use would be reduced to about 33% of the previous success rate. It basically had no flaws. Of course, the above information came from the game description of Pokémon. In a real situation, defend might have a limit to what it could withstand. However, as an extremely versatile defensive divine skill, it was already powerful enough. It should be easier to extract vocal rotation from Chiochio Sea Lion and Fairy Ibu, who have the same type of ultimate skill, bewitching voice. It should be easier to extract defend from Ivan and Big Milk Can. But the question now is, how can I extract this unlearned skill from them? They couldn't help but ponder. According to the teachings of Professor Kazair, there was a high probability that the Sure Kill skill card would extract the Sure Kill skill from the interface, and even if that was the target, it would still require some core materials that matched the skill as a guide and carrier. If the target was a Sure Kill skill that wasn't on the interface, it would be like building a pavilion in the air, which was a very stupid thing to do. I shouldn't bite off more than I can chew. The more Dake thought about it, the more unreliable he felt. Previously, someone seemed to have shown him the consequences of biting off more than one could chew. However, he couldn't remember who it was. So, it's better to lay the foundation first. After laying the foundation, I'll delve deeper into it. Moreover, it doesn't have to be suitable for a duel to choose a Sure Kill skill. It can be used in a real battle or in a real-life situation. Some Sure Kill skills can be very useful if they can be used to refresh their cooldown. 8:30 p.m. Dake returned to the dormitory. He had already released the magic guide fairies when he came back to get his homework in the afternoon. Because there was a duel today, and it was also the weekend, he gave the magic guide fairies a break and didn't give them any learning tasks. Therefore, as soon as he entered the door, the magic guide fairies were lying all over the place. In this regard, he just smiled a few times very implicitly, then put down his school bag and sat down at the desk. Then he took out a pen and paper and wrote down all the Sure Kill skills of the magic guide fairies. Since the refining of the Sure Kill skill card required the extraction of information from the magic guide fairy card, those magic guide fairies that required the Great Sin series of magic guide cards to evolve could not be the target of extraction of the Sure Kill skill. In fact, even the spell cage, Little Devil Beast, could not be extracted. In addition, passive skills could not be extracted. Therefore, there were not many Sure Kill skills to choose from at the moment. Enhanced Gastric Acid Feather Dance Imitation Cat Fist Cats Eye Transformation Bewitching Voice Moon Power Strength Equalization Defense Equalization Strength Trick Drink Milk Become Round Scroll. After listing all these possibilities, Dake's eyes lit up, and he felt that everything had become clear. Among these 14 Sure Kill skills, Transformation, combined with the original Shapeshifter, characteristic of the hundreds of transformed monsters, could be said to be terrifying. Shapeshifter, using transformation, does not consume magic power. As soon as he thought about having enough Sure Kill skill, Transformation, he could achieve a transformation without cooldown. Dake shuddered. It was not until now that he truly realized the value of the Sure Kill skill card. Professor Kazair is indeed the only master alchemist of the old era. Even if he changed his profession halfway, he could still establish such achievements in the field of magic guide. If this Sure Kill skill card is further refined, it may be a technology that can change the era. Dake could not help but feel more and more respect for the goblin mixed blood who was always so approachable. Moreover, after locking on to transformation, he almost immediately thought of the materials that could be compatible with it. Without a doubt, the Fantasy Beast's hair was the most suitable core material for refining Sure Kill skill. Transformation. The only problem was that the Fantasy Beast's hair was very precious and rare. It was difficult to find even in Traveler's Street. If he wanted to obtain the Fantasy Beast's hair, It was very likely that he would need to ask Professor Kazair for help. If the professor still has it and is willing to sell it, then it's done. Other than transformation, Dake also had his eyes on another skill that was slightly less valuable than transformation, but equally extraordinary. Drink milk. There was no need to elaborate on how powerful Big Milk Jug's drink milk skill was. More importantly, the core material that guided and carried this sure kill skill was traceable. This was completely different from equal distribution of strength, power cantrip, and equal distribution of defense, which were godly skills but could not be derived from the core material. With that in mind, Dake could not help but turn his gaze to the milkweed that was playing with the milkweed. After the juice of the milkweed was freshly squeezed through kettle pot, it would become the perfect material for refining sure kill skill. Drink milk. For now, let's settle on these two sure kill skills. Also, I have a direction for the core material. Dake waved at the milkweed, and it mooed and scurried over. Dake picked it up and placed it on his lap, gently twirling its round horns with his fingers, and could not help but laugh. Hypothetically, and it was only hypothetically, if one day, the milkweed learned how to use its own magic and mastered the normal summoning spells, and he had successfully mastered the exact method of refining sure kill skill, drink milk. Then he could let the milkweed carry a small backpack and stuff a lot of sure kill skill, drink milk, into it. At that time, the milkweed would be like a fish swimming in the vast sea and a bird flying in the vast sky. It would have inexhaustible magic, and it would not be a problem for it to wander around the entire castle. And the magic elves that wanted to go out with the milkweed mama would have to cry for milk from the milkweed mama. Wee-hee-hee. Dake narrowed his eyes and let out a strange laugh. This made the milkweed mama puzzled. With a goal in mind, everything became smoother. He practiced underworld magic for half an hour before going to bed, and he felt that his whole body was very cute. When he woke up the next day, he was in high spirits. After the morning exercise, Dake took a hot shower and sat down in front of the desk, eating the breakfast brought by the little fiend while reading today's Great Sage Daily. Although the Great Sage Daily had all kinds of problems, it always kept up with current affairs and grasped the timeliness. This was one of the main reasons why Dake had not given up on it until now. For example, today's Great Sage Daily had a picture of him holding fusion high on the contestants' stage. There were no cameras in this world, but there were all kinds of photographic technology, and there was also a special technology to create moving pictures. In the picture, Dake even looked back at him, and then the corners of his mouth curled up. Nike smile. Dake suddenly felt a chill. He continued to read, and found that it was a simple report about the new first-year duelists of the Shungmalian Academy. Every law enforcer was responsible for reporting this kind of content that directly revealed personal information in the newspaper. Dake couldn't help but frown. This report had information about 7 people. Among them, he was the leader, and his identity as Valkyrie's son and Crimson Star winner were highlighted. Next was White, son of the brave and honorable defeat. Then Sarah, daughter of the ancient sage. So Saraswati is the daughter of the ancient sage? When Dake saw this, he couldn't help but feel very surprised. Not everyone was willing to talk about their origins. He didn't know about Sarah's background until now through this newspaper. No wonder she has such a large reserve of knowledge, and can even make a secret ritual card. After being amazed, Dake continued to read. The 4th was Deanna, with the labels Bear of the Kingdom and Pearl of the Palm. The 5th was Dolan, with the label Dolan Family. The 6th was Justin, with the label Griffin Knights. Griffin Knights. Dake's mind suddenly stirred. The Griffin Knights were one of the 5 major knight orders in the kingdom. He didn't expect Justin Wayne to be someone with a background. However, when he took a closer look, he realized that this background was completely dug out. Justin Wayne was indeed related to the Griffin Knights, but that was only because his father was a captain of one of the Griffin Knights. The last report was naturally AI Ma. In order to create a gimmick, the newspaper indeed linked her to the Sage of Secrets. He wondered what the Sage of Secrets would think after seeing this. According to the plot of the main female lead novel, the Sage of Secrets should be a handsome old man who doesn't age. After seeing this newspaper by chance, not only did he not get angry, but he also cherished talent and personally took in a disciple. Tisk. Dake used a little force and bit the sausage in his mouth. The gravy overflowed, and a rich fragrance suddenly exploded in his mouth. After breakfast, Dake packed his things, carried his backpack, and went out. Ever since he went there at Christmas, Dake knew the location of Professor Khazer's dormitory. With the key card left by Claire, he was unimpeded all the way and soon arrived in front of Professor Khazer's dormitory. But when he raised his hand to knock on the door, he suddenly raised his eyebrows and wondered if he was too casual. At Christmas it was fine. After all, she had brought gifts with her. But this time there wasn't even a fruit basket. The ways of the world. Dake knocked his forehead and reflected. But he still knocked on the door of Professor Khazer's dormitory. Knock, knock, knock. Who is it? Well, let me guess. Who would come to find a lonely, stinky goblin like me at this time? Hearing the voice from inside the door, Dake was stunned. Even his hand that was knocking on the door froze. Professor? He said hesitantly. But Professor Khazer was still talking to himself. It can't be little Lily, right? But other than little Lily, who else could it be? Could it be little Nini? Oh no, maybe it's Hex. Could it be that his hands and feet can't hold on anymore? Or did he accidentally fall? Sigh, once a person gets old, they become useless. Even though the voice was through the door, it was very soft. But he could hear it clearly. The person who was talking was Professor Khazer, who was always very open-minded. Dake took a deep breath and felt like he came at the wrong time. Should I come back another day? Anyway, I have a backup plan. Drink milk. For tomorrow's introduction to magic, I'll make drink milk first. Click. While he was thinking, the door in front of him suddenly opened. Professor Khazer, who was wearing dark blue pajamas and a nightcap, appeared in front of Dake. The goblin mixed blood with wrinkled skin looked up at him. His eyes were not as muddled as he had imagined. So it's the small demon. It's so cold this morning. Why are you here? Even though it was not obvious on the surface, Professor Khazer's behavior was obviously different from normal. Dake quickly glanced inside the room. Because of the closed entrance, his vision was limited, but he could still see that the furnishings were neat. Even though Professor Khazer was single, he was good at housekeeping. He did not seem drunk. Don't look, I'm more awake than ever. Professor Katzel seemed to know what he was thinking, so he spoke casually. Dake could only say, Professor, I have something to ask you. Professor Khazer. Then come in first. It's rare for someone to visit. I can't leave you outside to feel the wind. Dake wanted to say, you didn't hesitate to send me off at Christmas. But considering that Professor Khazer's attitude was obviously not right, he was a bit more restrained. Sure enough, when Professor Khazer walked into the room, Dake immediately saw a familiar bottle on the table. The bottle of fairy wine. There was only a thin layer of wine left in the large bottle of fairy essence wine. Dake still remembered that he was drunk after 2 cups. He did not expect Professor Khazer to be able to drink the whole bottle and still be awake. That's scary. Also, who would drink so early in the morning? Dake looked around and found a book on the bedside table. It was The Old Knight of the Border. The bookmark was on the last page. It seemed that Professor Khazer had treated his Christmas gift well. Anyway, it was not a good place to stay. It was said that some people were drunk on the outside but not on the inside. They looked sober on the outside but were already drunk on the inside. Therefore, Dake simply went straight to the point. Professor, where can I find Fantasy Beast hair? You want Fantasy Beast hair? That's easy. Professor Khazer casually pointed at the wall cabinet. A beam of magic light shot out from his fingertip, and a magic array appeared on the front of the cabinet. Then, a smaller door slowly appeared where the cabinet's door was supposed to be. The magic door opened automatically, and the inside was completely different from the cabinet's magic space. The inside of the magic space was divided by countless grids. Placed in the grids were various materials that had been shrunk down. One of the materials had a label that said, Fantasy Beast hair. Dake's eyes lit up. He asked, how much is it? Professor Khazer smiled frivolously. 1,000 credits per hair, 8 to 10 centimeters. Dake's eyelids twitched. Fantasy Beast hair was actually this expensive? When they first made Fantasy Beast hair, they received 2 sets of materials, which were clearly free. If they failed, they could even buy an entire pack of materials for 100 credits, 1 hair per pack. So at that time, everyone had already made a huge profit. Dark estimated his credits and realized that the credits, which seemed to be a lot at first, would be emptied out once he used them. He took a deep breath and asked, "Can I get a discount if I buy 3 hairs? Like a 10% discount or something?" Professor Kazair smiled. "In the small dimming, if you want to get something, you have to pay a price. No one will help you for free. You can go ask little Nini how hard it is to get Fantasy Beast hair." "Okay, I'm just giving an example." Dake paid the credits and quickly slipped out of Professor Kazair's dormitory. He felt that the professor had become too dangerous after drinking. If he was sober, not to mention a discount, he might even get 1 hair for free. But it wasn't good to always be a freeloader. Dake Dimung was a student with integrity. 5 and 1/5200. How many votes is this character worth? Chapter 279. Walking out of the dormitory, Dake raised his head slightly. The sunlight was slanting down, illuminating his eyes. He closed his eyes and lowered his head. When he opened them again, he couldn't help but sigh. 9 out of 10 times, life was not smooth sailing. The older one got, the more regrets they had. So, adults always hoped that their children could have a happy childhood, because once they grew up, it would be difficult to achieve. The desire to muddle along and wait for death seemed simple, but it was something most people wished for. Dake raised the transparent bag and shone it under the sunlight. The 3 transparent hairs reflected a rainbow-colored light under the sunlight. These were the hairs of the magic beast. They were the core materials used to refine Ivan and the multiform monster. As for whether or not they could be used to refine the sure kill skill, transform, that would need to be tested. First website. https://m.vipcanchu. VIP originally, refining the sure kill skill card wasn't a mature technique. In order to refine the sure kill skill card, students would rack their brains to find the corresponding core materials. It was also a process of diverging thinking. Perhaps Professor Kazair didn't hold out much hope that the students would be able to successfully refine the sure kill skill card. It was enough for him to be able to learn more during the process of refining. Dake returned to the dormitory and carefully put away the hairs of the magic beast. Then he went out again and ran toward Traveler Street. Because of the newcomer competition the day before, a large number of first-year students chose to purchase materials on Sunday. So Traveler Street was full of familiar figures that day. In particular, the places where the basic materials were sold were already occupied by the first-year students. Dake spent a lot of effort to get through the line and buy all the basic materials. He bought a total of 6 sets. Based on the quality of the materials, each set was worth around 100 credits. 6 sets corresponded to 3 magic beast hairs and 3 chances to refine the sure kill skill. Drink milk. After refining 6 times, if he still didn't get anything, he would choose to cut his losses. By the time he finished buying the materials, it was already 2 in the afternoon. Before returning to the dorm, Dake went to the kitty flower shop, but he left after taking a look around. It seemed that the research and development of the catnip grass had indeed encountered a technical problem. It would probably take some time and luck to make a new breakthrough. After that, he didn't stop at Traveler Street. He carried his bags and returned to his dormitory. A small portion of the materials in his hands were raw materials that had not been processed. He needed to process them according to the textbook before he could use them in class. In addition, he also needed to extract at least 3 bottles of milkweed juice. Today was destined to be a busy and fulfilling day. The next day, Monday, Professor Shi-Erfu took the opportunity to talk about ritual summoning in the summoning class and praised Elsie Kevin's ritual summoning in the newcomers competition. Soon after, it was time for the second class. The long-awaited magic conducting class had finally arrived. Now that I think about it, the last experimental class seems to have been a long time ago. Diana's tone was filled with excitement. Her victory in the newcomers competition had earned her a total of 150 credits. She had spent a lot of money on the materials. When most of the students were running out of credits, Deanna could be said to be proud of her success. However, when she turned her head and saw the bags beside Dake's seat, she felt ashamed. She couldn't help but say in surprise, Dake, how many sets did you buy?" Dake made a number with his hand. Deanna covered her mouth. "Can you finish them in one class?" Dake said lightly. "Continue after class." Then he added, "While it's hot." Professor Kazair came to the classroom a few minutes early. He waved his magic wand and said a few words to the students. His wrinkled face was full of kindness. He was like a completely different person compared to yesterday's drunk state. People said that drunkenness reveals a person's heart. Perhaps he also had a cold side hidden in his heart. However, everyone had multiple sides. A single personality would only appear in novels, comics, or movies to emphasize the character's uniqueness. Ding ding ding. The bell that rang punctually for class was like a dividing line that separated the inside and outside of class. No matter how heavy their thoughts were outside of class, they couldn't help but calm down when they were in class. Professor Kazair knocked on the blackboard and said slowly, "I'm not the only one researching the crafting technique of the Sure Kill skill card. However, everyone's research progress and results are different. Therefore, what I teach is different from what other magisters teach. If any of you can master this technique of mine, you can call yourself my student if someone asks in the future." As soon as he finished speaking, the students below the stage began to whisper among themselves. The students that Professor Kazair spoke of were clearly different from the students in the academy's sense. That kind of relationship was like the relationship between Claire and Dake. It was a master and disciple in the personal sense. There was an inheritance of techniques, so it was much more intimate. Although he looked like an old goblin, Professor Kazair's reputation was very big outside. As the only master alchemist of the old era, as long as you mentioned his name, you would receive a lot of benefits. Even a practical young sage like Claire couldn't compare to Professor Kazair's prestige in the academic world. To be recognized as a student by him was clearly an honor. For a moment, everyone became excited. Even Dake couldn't help but become more serious. He had a good relationship with Professor Kazair, but there was still a clear dividing line between the two of them. If he could become a student, recognized by the professor, then that dividing line could be slightly dissolved. Among all the professors in the first year, Professor Kazair was the one he respected the most. Sometimes he would even subconsciously position him as an amiable grandfather. After a short pause, Professor Kazair continued, "Then we will now begin to review and deepen the content of the previous lesson. Remember to take notes." After he finished speaking, he tapped the chalk with his magic wand, and an alchemy array appeared on the chalk. After a moment, the chalk turned into a golem under the effect of alchemy. He gently waved his magic wand, and the chalk jumped up and began to write on the blackboard. This understated scene made Dake, who was in the back row, stunned. He couldn't help but complain, "Since you have this kind of technique, why do you have to stand on a stool and write on your toes? Maybe you don't want to show off. Maybe you want to be one with the pen and write by yourself. Who knows?" In short, with the previous encouragement, the student's attitude when taking notes was clearly a lot more correct. It didn't matter if you understood or not, just copy the notes first. After about half an hour, the theoretical knowledge review and the specific steps of the demonstration were completed. The students had an hour to concentrate on their experiments. At a glance, you would find that most of the students only prepared one set of materials. At most, they prepared more consumable materials. But as the core of the expensive materials, there were usually only one or two different materials. After all, with their level of knowledge, it was difficult to determine what the core material of a certain killing move was, so they had to prepare one or two more materials. Dake prepared magic beast hair and kettle brand milk grass juice. Deanna prepared a piece of nail that was said to be the claw of a bear-type monster. Luosi prepared a piece of shell from a small shellfish that belonged to the tortoise. The shell was decorated with colorful crystals that glowed under the sunlight. During the preparation stage, Dake couldn't help but take advantage of the last row to observe the other students' materials. He was more interested in AI Ma, but AI Ma's sitting posture was very upright. From his angle, he could only see a piece of golden light. This reminded Dake of the Christmas gift that AI Ma gave him, an ancient gold coin. Where did she find so many ancient gold coins? Dake's face darkened. Even if she wanted to spend money, she couldn't spend money like this, right? Dake withdrew his gaze from AI Ma and naturally looked at Luo Boat and White, who were also in the last row. Because in the last 2 weeks, the two of them seemed to have suddenly grown up and stopped pranking in class, so they were able to accumulate credits. Although they were still short of money and the quality of the materials was questionable, they had finally gathered enough for this experiment class. Dake glanced slightly and saw a pile of mechanical parts on Luo Boat's table. He didn't know what skill he was trying to extract. On White's table, there was a small bottle of dark red liquid. It seemed to be blood that had been refined. It was a bit hard to understand. Let's go our separate ways. Dake shook his head, and then focused his attention on the preparation of the experiment. There were 3 most important refining arrays in the refining of the SureKill skill card. The first one's function was identification. The second one's function was reading. The third one's function was reconstruction. These 3 core refining arrays were all adjusted by Professor Kazair, and were specially made to deal with the SureKill skill. They were not numbered and were not even publicly released. Most of the students didn't realize the preciousness of these refining arrays. They just followed the steps that Professor Kazair wrote on the blackboard and started to make them bit by bit. Starting from boiling the potion and processing the materials, although there were inevitable mistakes along the way, it was much smoother than last semester's refining experiment. After all, the students who were able to enter the Shengmalian Academy were all above the baseline in terms of magical talent. Even an idiot like Deanna had a very high magical talent. And an idiot like Luo Boat was actually very good in terms of the coordination of muscles and magical power. When used in magical experiments, the efficiency and control of magical power were higher than that of ordinary people. As for a talented person like White who was well-rounded in every aspect, there was no need to mention it. Professor Kazair patrolled back and forth in the classroom, and couldn't help but nod in satisfaction. The student's growth was visible to the naked eye. As a professor, he also felt a sense of accomplishment. Soon he came to Dake's side. He only woke up after noon yesterday. Then he recalled Dake's visit. When he thought about how he sold the fur of the fantasy beast to the students for 1,000 credits each, Professor Kazair couldn't help but want to cover his head. Headache. In the past, he was proud of his special ability to stay sober after getting drunk. Now he wished that he was the kind of person who would pass out after getting drunk. Although the price of 1,000 credits each was the market price, and most of them were priceless, he was a professor after all. He would get a discount when he sold them to the students. Basically, 1,000 credits could buy 3 hairs. But what was sold was like spilled water, and it couldn't be taken back. Therefore, he was already thinking about how to return the extra 2,000 credits Dake paid. What does he need? Professor Kazair couldn't help but stop beside Dake. In his eyes, Dake's talent in magical experiments was very high, or it could be said that his talent in alchemy was very high. If it was in the previous era, he would definitely have accepted him as an alchemy apprentice. But in this era, alchemy was a thing of the past. Sometimes he thought that it was better not to mislead the students. Things like Underworld God Spell, which was used to build the foundation, could be taught. But if he taught too many complicated things from other systems, it was likely that he wouldn't be able to get rid of the students. This was because there were conflicts in some core concepts between different systems. When he changed his profession from an alchemist to an archmage, he spent a lot of effort to change his perception. It was unknown when it started. Dake no longer felt restrained about Professor Kazair standing behind him and observing him. His operation was as smooth as ever. When he encountered some unavoidable mistakes, he was able to correct them in time. More than 6 times the amount of basic materials gave him the margin to redo it. In about 10 minutes, his table was already filled with all kinds of materials, placed in various plates, beakers, petri dishes, and test tubes. This time, he still used a very extravagant blank magic card that cost 50 credits each. The next 10 minutes. The blank magic card was already covered with all kinds of materials, stacked layer by layer until it was half a finger high. He drew the number 7 refining array on top of the materials, and then used the magic pen to press down on the center of the array bit by bit. The whole stack of materials was gradually refined and integrated into the magic card bit by bit. When this process was over, Dake's forehead was already covered with a thin layer of sweat. He put down the magic pen, took a towel from the side, wiped the sweat off his forehead, and then began the next step, drawing the 3 core refining arrays. These 3 refining arrays had to be drawn in one go, and the requirements for precise control of magic were not low. Many students would fail miserably in this part. But for Dake, whose magic level increased with the number of days, this was not too difficult. Only half a minute later, the 3 refining arrays were perfectly drawn. Then he injected magic to activate them. 3 beautiful light arrays popped out in an instant. Identify, read, reconstruct. Oh, Dake took out the Monster of Variety magic card and was about to put it on, identify, when he suddenly had an idea and whispered to the monster. Can you repeatedly recall the feeling when you transform in your mind? Busy? 2 and 1/4/150. I was going to write all night, but I didn't expect to fall asleep as soon as I leaned on the chair. Today's update will be done before 6 in the morning. Chapter 280. Identify, read, reconstruct. This was the temporary name of the 3 core refining arrays of the Sure Kill skill card. It was used when it was refined. In order to refine the Sure Kill skill card, one had to first identify the Sure Kill skill from the Magic Elf card, then read the identified Sure Kill skill, and finally construct the red Sure Kill skill in the Magic Elf card. In the entire process, identify was the leader. Once it could not be identified, everything would be for naught. In order to identify the desired Sure Kill skill from the Magic Elf card, one had to place the core material that matched the Sure Kill skill on the reconstruct, refining array to guide it. In the end, one needed to use this material as the core to reconstruct it. This was a circular process. After understanding this process, it would be easier to discover that the so-called identify, read, and reconstruct were a set of disk reading programs. And the Magic Elf card was a USB drive. Remember the URL. MVIP can't you? VIP identify was a search. Search for content related to the Sure Kill skill from the USB drive. The Sure Kill skill that was already on the interface was like a document placed in a folder. The Sure Kill skill that was not on the interface but had the potential to be learned was a hidden document that had gone through layers of encryption. The difficulty of searching for the two was naturally different. Moving the document of the Sure Kill skill from the depths of the folder to the front would make it easier to be searched. In other words, it was to let the Magic Elf card extract this part of the memory from the depths of the mind to the surface. That was recall. Recall the memory of releasing the Sure Kill skill. Other Magic Elves might not be able to do this. However, every one of Dake's Magic Elves could do it. And it was very easy. After receiving Dake's order, the monster in the card could not help but recall the scene when it first met its master and transformed into its master's head. At this moment, Dake had not even put in the magic illusion beast hair into the reconstruct, and the identify refining array had already lit up. This was the sign of a Sure Kill skill being recognized. This is, Professor Kazair, who was standing behind Dake, couldn't help but have a change in expression. Dake's actions were a little out of his expectations, but when he considered that Dake's magic guiding fairies had intelligence levels higher than 3, such actions seemed normal again. But that was something that even he could not replicate. This is not universal. A technology that transcended eras and could change eras had to be universal. Whether it was the Merlin array, Dalton array, or Demeter array, they were all like this. Even the Arvet refining array had a certain degree of universality. However, if the Sure Kill skill card array required the support of the magic fairy's high intelligence, then it could only be an exclusive array for personal use. Unless high IQ could also be popularized. This thought flashed through Professor Kazayer's mind before he threw it into the trash can. How could it be so easy to popularize a technology that many archmages yearned for? If it could be popularized, the entire magical engineering era would be overturned. Professor Kazayer couldn't help but continue to observe Dake's experiment. After the identify array lit up slightly, Dake still placed the magic beast hair on the reconstruct array. After that, he poured in magic power to guide and fine-tune it. This allowed the identify, read, and reconstruct arrays to light up one after another. Once the light stabilized, he could remove the magic guiding fairy card from the identify array and adjust the arrays so that the three arrays would shrink together. Finally, he placed the rest of the materials on the reconstruct array and slowly refined it bit by bit. It was like boiling bone soup. The core ingredient was the bones, but it also needed other ingredients. This step was more difficult than imagined. Because there was no precise refining formula, the type and quantity of materials to put into the array, as well as the quality and so on, had to be controlled by oneself. Even a senior magus would find it difficult to do it perfectly, let alone a first-year magus. Therefore, the original purpose of this class, which was the so-called experience, was to let the little magus have a preliminary understanding of the advanced refining method. At the same time, Professor Kazayer might have thought of using them as guinea pigs. Children's ideas were the most imaginative. Perhaps from their actions, one could find the method and opportunity to perfect the refining method. While still in the process of refining, Professor Kazayer discovered that Dake's Surekill skill card had failed. Although it might have been barely formed in the end, it was still a failed Surekill skill card. He narrowed his eyes slightly and continued to watch. As he expected, Dake had already discovered that something was wrong when he was at the end of the refining. The experience gained from studying Curse Cage and Fusion told him that there was a mistake in the refining this time. However, at this point in the refining, there was no turning back. He could only continue. 2 minutes later, after all the materials were refined, the refining array was also collected into the magic card. A strange black shadow gradually appeared on the surface of the card. It looked very similar. Dake was a little hesitant. However, he still used tweezers to pick up the magic card and rinsed it. Then he took out Fantasy Beast, Strange Creature, and prepared to experiment. At this time, many people in the classroom were already looking over. Although he sat in the corner of the last row, he still could not escape the attention of the students. Even if only one person found out about it, the news would spread like wildfire and spread like wildfire. Soon, everyone in the classroom knew that Dake Dimming was once again the first to complete the refining of the magic card. In the name of Dake Dimming, I summon Fantasy Beast, Strange Creature. After a quick chant, a cute lavender elf appeared on the table. Dake picked up the Surekill skill card that had just been refined and activated it with the usual summoning spell. As the Surekill skill card emitted a white light that gradually intensified, the strange creature's body gradually emitted a light of a similar frequency. Poof! The strange creature became Crooked Dake. Lying on the table, with only one face that had completed the transformation of bean-eyed Crooked Dake, Dake could not help but laugh. Oh, Deanna and Luosi, who turned around from the front row, also quickly covered their mouths and could not help but laugh. The students nearby could not help but tiptoe to take a look. Then they all laughed. The classroom was gradually filled with cheerful laughter. Then, boom, someone's pincer exploded. Wah! Screams suddenly sounded. Professor Kazayer quickly waved his magic wand and water from the sky extinguished the flames. However, the unknown liquid that flowed out of the pincer had already corroded the table. A strong stench suddenly exploded. Open the window! Open the window! The students screamed crazily. Whether they were smelled or not, they were all screaming crazily. The Aristocrat Academy students by the window quickly opened the window to let the stench out. Oh my God, my dear God! What did you put in there? The students in the front row of white could not help but scream. Their screams were also drowned out by the noise. No one cared who caused the explosion. They only knew that screaming was really fun. When the classroom calmed down a little, Dake shook his head slightly, picked up a pen, and recorded the ratio of materials that he had refined this time. He was going to make adjustments when he went back. There was not enough time left to do another experiment. He felt that his overall operation was not bad. The main problem was that he needed to improve on the details. However, the degree of deviation of the failed product in his hand was greater than it seemed on the surface. This was because the transformation extracted from the failed product did not copy the data. It was the kind of transformation that only changed the shape, and it was incomplete. Originally, he thought that the polymorph only had one sure-kill skill: transformation. As long as it succeeded, it would definitely be extracted. He did not expect, "Maybe there's something wrong with my thinking." Dake recalled what he said when he asked the polymorph to recall the feeling of transformation. He thought for a while. But these are all small problems. This experiment has basically verified that asking the magic fairy to recall sure-kill skills will help in the refinement of the sure-kill skill card. If I draw inferences from one case, does it mean that if I ask the magic fairy to recall sure-kill skills that are not on the interface but have learned in the skull, it will be able to extract sure-kill skills that are not on the interface? This is a very good experiment direction. Dake quickly recorded his thoughts in case he forgot. After that, he stretched out his hand to tease the polymorph and began to clean up the remnants of the experiment. Busy. The polymorph smiled crookedly. It stretched out its tentacles, transformed them into hands, and began to help clean up. A few minutes later, everything was cleaned up. Dake leisurely observed the other students. The progress of the students' experiments was uneven, but they were not particularly fast. Some students' progress was so slow that it was obvious that they had to wait until after class. Some students were quite fast, but it seemed that they had not mastered the core of the sure-kill skill card. After Deanna and Luosi finished laughing, they hurriedly threw themselves into their own experiments. That moment of distraction almost caused their experiment to go down the drain. And on the other side, Luoboat's experiment was surprisingly better than White's. White was trying to salvage the exploded pincer pot with a panicked expression. Aima's ancient gold coins were missing by 1 or 2. Ring, ring, ring. When the bell rang for the end of class, the students could not help but howl in grief. Those who failed their experiments happily carried their backpacks to the cafeteria. Those who did not fail their experiments were eagerly waiting for their experiments to fail. This experiment class was destined to have a strong start but a weak finish. No one succeeded in the entire class. After the potions class in the afternoon, Dake took advantage of the fact that Professor Thompson was still there and rushed up with his notebook. He asked all the questions he had about potions in the morning's experiment class. Thompson could be said to be the most normal professor in the first year. He put down the textbook in his hand and patiently explained. Dake listened while taking notes. A few key words could form a paragraph. After about 10 minutes, he obtained the knowledge he wanted. After that, he did not bother the professor anymore and tried to figure it out himself. That afternoon, he did not go straight to the library. Instead, he went back to his dorm and started the experiment. Learning from the lesson in the magic guide class, he communicated with the polymorph monster in detail before the experiment. He asked it to remember the feeling of the transform skill and not its normal transformation. This time, the experiment went quite smoothly, but the final result was still not satisfactory. Dake summoned the little devil monster and asked the polymorph monster to follow the transform skill. But after the transformation, the polymorph monster released a small dart that was soft and its attributes were obviously lower. It was obvious that the transform skill was not 100% effective. There's a difference between a complete and incomplete skill card. This discovery made Dake very depressed. But after thinking about it, it seemed to make sense. He once again recorded the various steps of the experiment. This time, he was going to use the materials of the milk can to practice. Anyway, the core materials of the milk can were endless. After deducting the cost of the core materials, a material pack only costs 100 credits. He could do more in-depth research through repeated experiments. Mumu. The milkcan stretched its head out and rubbed Dake's palm. Then it rubbed its hands together and rubbed out a bottle of milk. It intimately handed its milk to Dake. Dake drank it in one gulp. He was full of energy. Then he started a new experiment. With the previous 2 experiments as a foundation, the process of this experiment was relatively smooth. The milk can's recall was also very accurate. The result was a success. Finally, a sure-kill skill, drink milk, card was created. Dake immediately experimented with it. Although the sure-kill skill card this time was also flawed, it could restore 1/3 of the mana value, which was already very good. Drink milk and transform were, after all, different types of skills. After the effect of drink milk was reduced, it was still significant. After the effect of transform was reduced, it became a sludge monster. Dake continued to work hard and completed the remaining 2 experiments in one go. In the end, the second sure-kill skill, drink milk, failed, but the third sure-kill skill, drink milk, was a success. It could restore about 2/5 of the mana value, which was very close to 1/2 of the strongest effect. Unfortunately, at this time he only had 1 basic material pack left in his hand. Moreover, the ingredients for transformation were different from the ingredients for milk drinking. I bought too little. Dark sighed, looking as if he still wanted to continue. He slightly raised his head and noticed that it was already 9:30 at night. Happy times were always short-lived. He even forgot to eat dinner. Wait for Friday. Dake did not continue to experiment on the transform, sure-kill skill card. Instead, he analyzed and summarized the steps and results of the drink milk, sure-kill skill card. He was going to wait until Friday to buy more materials and perfect the sure-kill skill, drink milk. Then he would restart the sure-kill skill, transform, refining experiment. In the blink of an eye, it was Tuesday. Dake was still immersed in the research of the sure-kill skill card. But a new storm was coming. During Tuesday's duel class, Professor Cheong-si praised the 7 duelists and collected all the homework. Then, she put the thick pile of homework aside and began to explain the 7 duels one by one. The order of the explanation was according to the order of the duels. Doran, who bore the brunt of it, was completely stunned. Everyone said that it was a good start, and he also had a good start. It was the red in blood. Clearly, he had forgotten about the rookie duel after he finished his analysis paper. However, Professor Cheong-si brought it up again, reminding him of the crushing defeat in the rookie duel. Although it was not to the extent of being publicly sentenced, he still pursed his lips and clenched his fists. Next time, I must win it back. Sob. Professor Cheong-si's analysis was naturally much better than the first-year students'. After Doran's initial mood tantrum, he was immersed in a few words. He had a deep and simple understanding of his mistakes in the debut battle. In the homework he had just handed in, he blamed most of his defeat on the fact that he did not have a second-tier magic guide sprite. Although that was also a big reason. However, he did not do his best in that duel. Professor Cheong-si finally concluded. When Doran went on stage, he did not think of winning. This is the biggest problem. These merciless words made little Doran's face turn pale. However, Professor Cheong-si was not a soft person. This was also her teaching characteristic. I've always said that you have to look at victory and defeat with a normal heart. Don't be arrogant if you win, and don't be discouraged if you lose. Every victory or defeat was a baptism for him. Absorbing experience and becoming stronger is the fate of a duelist. A duelist who doesn't want to win is not a good duelist. Professor Cheong-si's teaching was powerful and resonant. While Doran's face was pale, White Gouda, who was in the last row of the classroom, also turned white. Professor Cheong-si's criticism of Doran not only pierced through Doran's heart, but it also crossed dimensions and pierced White's heart full of holes. White, what's wrong? Luobot saw that his expression was not right and hurriedly asked. White was in a daze for a moment before he subconsciously said, nothing. Luobot. Hey, you don't look like you're fine. White forced a smile. Look at my gorgeous smile. The weather today is so good. Luobot. Wouldn't it be better to use handsome to describe your smile? White. In any case, Luobot's joke still made White feel a little better. He widened his eyes and continued to listen to the lecture. It was drizzling outside the window, and the sound of writing could be heard inside the window. After Professor Cheong-si finished analyzing Doran's duel, he began to analyze Deanna's duel. The students listened more and more seriously. 2 and 5 and 1, 5,000. 5,000, 1,000, more than 4,000. Chapter 281. Deanna's duel was outstanding. On the surface, it seemed that she won because her deck was good enough. However, the calmness and quick-wittedness she showed during the duel was not something an ordinary person could compare with. If one had not seen her duel, they would not have thought that the little fool who usually looked silly could perform so well. After Deanna, Professor Cheong-si also analyzed Justin Wayne's duel. This bright young man from the Academy of Knights had his own unique tactics and mentality. The only reason that stopped him from winning was that the quality of his magic cards could not keep up with the quality. Professor Cheong-si did not criticize him because of his defeat. Instead, she gave him a lot of praise. Basically, she used her own words and actions to practice her attitude towards winning and losing. After the students' expectations, Professor Cheong-si finally began to analyze Dake Diming's duel. Many students actually wanted to analyze this duel, but due to their limited ability or some other reasons, they chose to analyze other subjects. This time, Professor Cheong-si personally explained it, so that the students could keep their interest and learn more. However, her explanation this time did not focus on the strength of Dake's deck or anything else. Instead, she only analyzed it from the duel's techniques to a certain extent. Remember, https://m, VIP can't you? VIP beginners often make a mistake in a duel, and that is, they are used to using all the magic cards they have in their hands. It's best if they can suppress the opponent, but if they can't, it's very likely that they'll be wiped out. So in a duel, it is very important to learn how to preserve one's cards. Dake Diming's performance in this duel was very good. It is worth learning from. After choosing some words to say, Professor Cheong-si changed to another angle. In addition, today I would like to take this opportunity to talk about the command of the magic elves in a duel. As everyone knows, the intelligence level of the magic elves is only 2. 5. They do not have a complete thinking circuit. Most of their movements require the command of a magus. Although there is a delay in the process of issuing orders, receiving them, and then carrying them out, the magic elves usually fight head-on. But the importance of command is still undeniable. Many people are used to shouting orders when giving orders, as if that's the only way for the magic elf to hear them. But in fact, we have another way of commanding that is more gentle. Professor Cheong-si took out a magic card and placed it between his index and middle fingers, showing it to the students. She then rubbed her 2 fingers together, and the magic card began to spin on her fingertips. A pink, light, balloon-like magic elf shot out from the card and appeared in the air. In this duel, Dake Diming has used this method many times. This is my float. Floatio was a type of ornamental magic guide sprite with 0 attack and defense. Professor Cheong-si blew at the float, and it wobbled and flew above the students' heads. Professor Cheong-si held the magic card firmly, and injected a trace of magic into her fingertips. She put the float card to her lips and whispered a few words, and the float flew in a heart shape in the air. She said, "Using this method, you only need to use magic to draw a special magic array on the magic card, and then continue to inject magic into it. The magic card can be used as a relay station, and through speaking to the magic card, the magic guide sprite on the magic card can receive orders. The advantage of this method of commanding is that you can command the magic guide sprite from afar, and you don't have to worry about your tactics being leaked. The disadvantage is that it requires a lot of magic to maintain. For magi who don't have enough magic, they can use it selectively to protect the secrecy of their tactics." Dake didn't expect his little secret to be exposed so quickly. He leaned back in his chair and sighed slightly. In fact, this method of commanding was written in the textbook of duel class, but it hadn't been taught yet. He had only previewed and mastered it in advance. After all, shouting in a duel was sometimes hot-blooded, but it made him look like an idiot. Only when one's emotions had reached a point where they would naturally shout out loud. Otherwise, he didn't like that kind of meaningless shouting. Using the aristocratic way of explaining it, it was too inelegant. As for his magic, at this moment, his magic power wasn't inferior to that of an adult archmage. In the duel with Elsie Kevin, Dake frequently used this method to issue very detailed orders to the magic guide sprites. For example, the timing of Kettle's killing move, the reminder of Diru Beast's dodging, and so on. Of course, there were also times when he couldn't help but shout, just like Changeable Monster's transformation. He was able to win the duel with Elsie Kevin because of a combination of many factors, and it wasn't just a card deck advantage in the eyes of some people. In the analysis paper of his own duel, Dake emphasized the advantages of this method of commanding. After explaining Dake's duel, Professor Cheong-si continued to explain the duels of White, Ai Ma, and Sarah. This duel class came to an end. There was no homework today. Then the second class on Tuesday morning, the nightmarish arithmetic class struck again. Professor Lily put away the test papers 5 minutes before the class started. Then, she flipped through them and found that all the papers were filled in. She nodded with satisfaction and continued with her math class. However, except for the students of the aristocratic academy and a few of the top students, most of the students didn't even have a good foundation. It was impossible for them to understand more in-depth classes. This reality could only be understood when Professor Lily personally graded the homework this time. Tuesday afternoon's History of Magic. Professor Ryan Hacks seemed to have tried to look for history books. For the first time, he began to talk about history before modern times. He actually looked like a professor of history of magic. Wednesday morning's potionology class. Professor Thompson taught a potion called melanin soup. It was said to be the gospel of the night watchers. It could help people stay awake at night. The boy's eyes widened, and he listened to the class attentively. It seemed that with this melanin soup, hundreds of millions of rounds were no longer a dream. After that, in the summoning class, Professor Shi Erfu explained in more detail the common summoning and sacrificial summoning spells, especially the sacrificial summoning spell. She gave out the summoning cards for practice and let the students practice on their own. Then she personally taught them. Even Dake benefited a lot. Just by correcting a key point, he made a breakthrough in his sacrificial summoning spell. It had to be said. After all, there was a lack of knowledge in the textbooks. Studying could not cover everything. The personal teaching of the professors was better than studying for a month. After a week of reincarnation, it was finally time for astronomy again. The little magisters still remembered the prophecy from last week, especially the prophecy homework, which left a deep impression on them. Fortunately, the noble house had Dake, the notebook maniac, but the other academies were not so lucky. They all racked their brains and racked their brains. As for whether or not the prophecy was missing a word, they could only ask the heavens. But when it came to homework, it was already over. None of this could change the interest of astronomy. I wonder what Professor Mitya Bartholomew will talk about in tonight's astronomy class? I guess it's the stars. I like the moon better. According to astronomy, the moon is one of the stars, right? I don't care. The moon is the moon, and the stars are the stars. After dinner, the little magisters rushed to the 12th floor of the spiral clock tower one after another. The 12th floor of stairs was indeed a torturous climb for the students. Just like how they felt at the moment, mixed with anticipation for astronomy class and rejection of the homework. Before 7:30 in the evening, the sky was already dark. A dim moon was curled up in the distant sky. Although it was not so dark that they could not see their fingers, it was still difficult to see the road ahead. If not for the railings of the spiral staircase being sturdy enough and giving off a very reliable feeling, there would definitely be people with acrophobia. The little magisters either summoned their magic fairy, or used magic cards to illuminate the front and slowly walked up. Dake leisurely followed the crowd, holding the magic card Illusory Beast, Ivan in his hand. Tonight he still brought little Ivan with him. Yee-yee! After entering the astronomy classroom, the students sat in their usual seats. Then, they began to discuss and speculate with anticipation. It was only when the cuckoo bird drilled out of the wall clock that someone suddenly realized that Professor Mitya Bartholomew was late again. Right at the top of the clock tower, a witch dressed as usual sat in a pumpkin carriage that blended into the night. She lifted the curtain and looked down at the castle. A voice came from beside her. "Mitya, why are you always late?" Mitya's voice carried a natural and strong charm. Being a little late can increase people's expectations. If you are always on time, it will not be beautiful. I understand, the voice helplessly said. It is a bad habit of the prophets. Mitya could not help but cover her mouth and chuckle. You are right. Well, hide, I am going down. Then there was no sound in the carriage. The pumpkin carriage was pulled by two black beasts. It drilled out of the curtain of night and put on a bright color, as if it was a carriage that came out of a fairy tale. The students in the classroom had already opened their eyes wide and looked up. As the ceiling became transparent, the pumpkin carriage came into view. Mitya passed through the two sides of the ceiling and drove the carriage to the podium. Then she lifted the curtain and leaned out of the carriage, making people's hearts tremble. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. With a charming smile, the witch took off her pointed witch hat, letting her soft black and purple hair fall down like a waterfall. The ends of her long hair were slightly curled, with a trace of playfulness. Mitya took out her magic wand from her witch hat and stretched out her hand to touch the carriage. The carriage disappeared along with the rising smoke. Then she put her hat on the table and said, This week, I am 1 minute earlier than last week. This is an improvement. As long as the foundation is low enough, you can always improve. Hearing Mitya's words, Dake could not help but have black lines appear on his face. Although this professor was a real talent, her character did not seem to be reliable. Then the first question, who am I? Professor Mitya Bartholomew tapped her magic wand. In the classroom, a boy raised his hand high. The boy looked at Professor Mitya with eyes full of passion, and he said fanatically, You are the guide of fate, the diviner of the eyes of the stars, the witch of the silver moon, and the lover of my dreams, Mitya Bartholomew. You are very correct, Professor Mitya said without the slightest anger. Brad Gunter deducts 10 points. Also, I feel that it is not suitable for you to dream recently. Then she blinked her eyes, and the boy from the Knights department was stunned. A purple crescent mark appeared on his forehead. The crescent mark was surrounded by a black pattern, as if it wanted to lock something. Brad Gunter subconsciously touched his forehead with a dumbfounded expression. However, Professor Mitya only waved her wand, and he sat down on the floor. Pa! A loud sound was heard. The sound was so loud that it seemed like the chair was going to crack. Professor Mitya continued with a calm face. The moon tonight is very round. It is the time when the trajectory of fate is the most obvious. Among you, has anyone tried divination before? But at this time, the students in the audience were shocked by Brad Gunter's encounter. Of course, no one knew whether the shock was mixed with fear or gloating. Saraswati raised her hand. Professor, I have tried divination with stones, but that was when I was young. Mitya nodded. Although stone divination is a small trick, it can be used to predict good or bad luck. AI Métis was not willing to be left behind. Professor, I have tried gold coin divination, but it is not very accurate. Mitya smiled and said, I've been doing this for a long time, but the simpler the steps, the higher the requirement for the fortune teller. Wait until you finish my astronomy class. Maybe you'll be able to do it more accurately. Then she slightly moved her eyebrows and looked at White Gouter in the back row. We have experienced all kinds of interesting things in our childhood. So Hero's son, please answer me. Have you played similar divination games in your childhood? White was stunned for a moment, then he stood up and shook his head. Sorry, Professor. I have not played any divination games. The witch's hat on the table shook slightly. Mitya changed the topic. That is not a problem. Today, our topic is to observe the moon. She waved her magic wand, and the closed ceiling opened again. A few minutes ago, the moon was still dim, but now it was abnormally bright. Under the moonlight, there were many shadows. Chapter 282. The students raised their heads to look at the sky in shock. Not only was the moonlight dim when they climbed up the spiral staircase. When Professor Mitya drove the pumpkin carriage into the classroom from the ceiling, they also saw that the moon in the sky was not bright. But in such a short time, the night sky seemed to have been replaced with a curtain. The moon in the center of the composition became big and round. This gave people the illusion that Professor Midya had used a method to change the sky and earth. Dark squinted his eyes as he observed the moon, deep in thought. Since ancient times, many so-called miracles had been displayed like this. But in reality, it was very likely that it was a natural phenomenon of the clouds scattering and the moon appearing. It was just that Professor Midya had grasped the timing of the phenomenon's change. A qualified prophet could always grasp all kinds of opportunities to show themselves. Website: https://m.vipcanchu. VIP. Most of the time, their prophecies were not real divinations. They relied on their profound knowledge to accurately speculate about various phenomena. After all, every time they did a divination, they had to pay a high price. If they did a divination every time they encountered an event, then the real prophets should have been extinct. Dake vaguely remembered that a famous magician once said that the core of magic was actually acting skills. Every brilliant magician was a qualified actor. And after he gradually understood the profession of prophets, he realized that the so-called prophets were all actors. Thinking about it this way, little Ivan, who was proficient in the ultimate skill, imitation, was a natural prophet? Little Ivan, who was in the magic card, looked at the night sky under Dake's poking. His little face was full of curiosity. Suddenly, a water-like transparent film appeared on the open ceiling. Strange rays of light shot out from the four boundaries, splitting the moonlight into small, densely packed pieces, which were projected in front of everyone. Professor Midya waved her magic wand and used a special magic to adjust it. On the table of each student, a small piece of the night sky appeared. The bright moon rose and fell in the clouds. Clouds gathered and scattered. Sometimes it was submerged in the clouds. Sometimes it was showing its beauty. The students all revealed looks of astonishment. Their attention shifted from the bright moon in the sky to the projection on the table. At first glance, it was as if the scene in the sky had been transferred to the table. People couldn't help but reach out their hands to carefully touch and hold it. They were so excited that their fingers trembled slightly. This miraculous projection magic was far beyond the reach of ordinary people. It was as if the moon in the well and the flower in the mirror were truly astonishing. So beautiful. The girls' voices were filled with joy. Although the boys didn't make a fuss, they were all inexplicably excited. Humans were just that emotional. The moon is an especially important part of the stars. Since ancient times, people have observed the stars and worshipped the sun and moon because the stars have divine power. Deducing fate from the orbits of the stars is part of astrology. Professor Midya's voice was like flowing water in a quiet forest. Her words penetrated one's heart and made one remember them unconsciously. Our topic tonight is to deduce the future from the moon and perform divination. Now let's observe the moon carefully. Yes, Ai Ma Métis. Is there a problem? Ai Ma raised her hand and said, Professor, isn't there a specific method? I mean something like a spell? Midya couldn't help but squint and smile. Yes, of course there is. But it's not something that can be done by beginners. What we need now is to find that little bit of feeling first. She raised her hand and hooked her thumb and index finger into a ring, indicating slightly. In fact, divination was a talent. Some people were born with knowledge. Some people were born with divine eyes. If they could see it, they could do it. If there was no need for more than a talent, it would be impossible to see it. But the potential of the human brain was difficult to guess. The talent related to this could not be directly expressed like magic power. Therefore, it was difficult to determine whether a person had the talent for divination or not. This gave more room for imagination. Some so-called prophets relied on such a pitiful obsession to survive until old age, but in the end, they achieved nothing and could only rely on acting and deception to survive. In short, Ai Ma sat down after getting the answer. The students also widened their eyes and observed the bright moon on the table more seriously. As for whether they could find a little bit of feeling from it or see something. In any case, Dake couldn't see anything at all. He blinked his eyes and tried his best to see the uneven surface of the moon on the table, but the pixel of the moon was clearly not enough. No matter how carefully he looked, he could only see the changes in the moon's brightness, some undetectable movements, the surrounding clouds, and the occasional flash of stars in the quiet night. He couldn't imagine how he could speculate the future from this little bit of information. Maybe he really didn't have the talent in this area. Or maybe it was because he had already lost his childhood innocence and could no longer learn astrology. But fortunately, he still had the heartwarming little Ivan. Dake turned the stand around and placed it on the edge of the table, facing himself. Then he placed Illusory Beast, Ivan, on the stand so that Ivan could clearly see the changes in the moon. Did you see anything? Dake injected magic into the tip of the magic pen and poked Ivan's head. However, Ibuzachan shook his head like a rattledrum and stared at him anxiously. No hurry. Dake was still very patient, especially when supervising others' work. It's useless to act coquettishly. Dake poked his little ear again. Little Ivan's face was full of resentment. After a few minutes of quiet observation, the little magisters who couldn't see anything couldn't help but whisper. More and more noises started to appear in the classroom. Midya's gaze swept the entire classroom and finally stopped on Eudora. Feeling carefully, she found that the atmosphere with her as the center was gradually changing. She seemed to be immersed in some kind of feeling. Professor Midya nodded slightly and introduced a projection on her desk. Then she clapped her hands and said, "The knowledge of divination is endless. Astrology is only one part of it. If you want to learn astrology, imagination is very important. First of all, we have to let our thoughts be unconstrained. We can see deer from horses, green from the sun, and star charts from people. Diviners are rational, but beginners are emotional. Let go of your thoughts and do your best to make everything wonderful." Midya tapped her magic wand lightly, and the night sky on the desk suddenly changed. The dark background of the night sky seemed to have turned into ink. It swept up and swallowed the night sky like a wave. Finally, it turned into a three-dimensional starry sky of stars. From that starry sky, the moonlight shot out a line and connected all the stars, forming a flickering star chart. It was magnificent. With just this point, some people in the classroom suddenly entered a state of mind. The starry sky on many people's desks had slight changes. Professor Midya continued to tap on the star chart, and then lit up 9 stars in turn. 9 is the number of extremes. Tonight, 9 stars will shine brightly. At this moment, bright starlight burst out on Eudora's desk. The starlight that held up the night sky and illuminated the darkness flickered frequently, as if time had accelerated. Eudora opened her hands, and her fair and tender face was full of confusion. Unknowingly, her eyes had been dyed pitch black. Specks of twinkling stars adorned them, mysterious and profound. Professor Midya narrowed her eyes abruptly, and the silver moon in the depths of her eyes gradually rose. The little sorcerers present were even more shocked. A few students around Eudora seemed to know her for the first time. They showed an abnormally shocked expression, and then they couldn't help but retreat. The focus of the entire classroom was on her. Dake didn't forget to turn the face of the magic card to Eudora. Although he had expected it, he was also surprised. Even if he hadn't seen it personally, he could guess that this was a sign of divination. Unlike Professor Midya's casual prediction during the first lecture, Eudora's divination was likely to be official. Stars appeared in her eyes. She was observing fate. Suddenly there was a scream. Eudora's face instantly distorted, revealing a painful expression. The stars in her eyes became chaotic. The starry sky in front of her swept like a storm. A majestic and terrifying atmosphere suddenly erupted. Silently, they forced the surrounding students of the Aristocrats' Academy away. A panicked voice sounded at the same time. Some were flustered, and some were excited. At this moment, almost everyone realized that Eudora was performing a divination. The girl at the same table looked at Professor Midya helplessly. She looked at her for help. However, the professor only raised her hand and gestured for her to be quiet. Midya's expression was equally serious. A diviner's first prophecy was actually very dangerous, because no one knew what price she had to pay for it. Every fortune teller had to pay a different price at different times. Some diviners even had to pay with their lives at the first divination. Their prophecies were their last words. However, if they interrupted the divination at this moment, there would be a backlash. Of course, Medea wouldn't do that. Every true diviner had to experience the first time. This was inevitable, and it was also the first step to climb to the sky. Eudora was taking the first step. This was a good thing. Bang! The starry sky on the table suddenly exploded. Eudora's eyes instantly widened. Her pink lips opened and closed slightly, and a toneless voice slowly came out. I still have something to do in the afternoon. I'll continue writing when I come back tonight. Chapter 283. The stars have fallen, the sky has collapsed, the day will no longer be day, the night will no longer be night, and the gods will no longer be gods. Blood. Blood. It's all blood. Piles of bones, mountains of corpses. He's dead, she's dead, they're all dead. Everyone has to die. Ah! With another scream, Eudora suddenly came back to her senses. The dark night sky in her eyes retreated like a tide, and her eyes became clear again. The fear that appeared on her face just now was like an act. There was no trace of it left. She looked around blankly, as if she was very confused that she had suddenly become the focus of attention. What happened? Remember the website, MVIP, can't you? VIP with great effort, Eudora asked with a trembling voice. However, the students were also shocked by her shocking prophecy at this moment. Even Professor Medea couldn't help but stop in her tracks. Professor, what price did she pay? Dake Diming's voice came from behind, causing Professor Medea to suddenly wake up. She quickly composed herself and glanced in the direction of Dake, seemingly surprised by his clear thinking. Then she walked back to Eudora and bent down. As her cleavage tilted, she reached out to hold Eudora's face and observed it carefully. Eudora was a child with a very soft personality on the surface. At this time, she didn't know how to deal with it at all. She could only let Professor Medea fiddle with her repeatedly. After a long while, Professor Medea took a deep breath and stared at Eudora's eyes with a solemn gaze. In those timid eyes, there was a shining golden star that couldn't be hidden. Although Eudora had the eyes of stars would not appear in her normal state. Now the golden star in her eyes was obviously the aftereffect of divination. Although it's not the most fatal, it's the most troublesome type. Medea couldn't help but frown. However, this was not something that could be said directly in front of the students. At this time, as a professor, she should find a way to appease the fear caused by the prophecy. Therefore, she relaxed her brows very naturally and revealed a relieved smile. Fortunately, there are no obvious aftereffects. After class, come with me to Sister Kalien and do a thorough check. Hearing this, Eudora asked timidly, Professor, what happened just now? Medea waved her wand, and a stream of light appeared in the air. She smiled and said, Congratulations, you have completed your first divination as an astrologer. First divination? Eudora looked blank. But why don't I remember anything? Medea smiled. There are a lot of factors involved in this. It's related to magic power, and the brain's ability to withstand it. Of course, it is also related to the strength of your astrology. Eudora couldn't help but lower her head and ask nervously, Do you mean that I can become an astrologer? Medea smiled and nodded. Yes. If you are willing, I would like to be your guide. Eudora opened her mouth in disbelief. Professor Medea had left a very good impression on the little mages. Not to mention her series of titles, just the fact that she was from Star Tower was a huge plus point. Star Tower could be said to be the holy land of astrologers. Every astrologer was proud to be able to enter Star Tower. If Eudora became Professor Medea's disciple, entering Star Tower in the future was basically a matter of certainty. Medea rubbed her head gently and said softly, Don't be too anxious to make a decision. Let's have a good talk after class. After all, this is a very important matter, and it also requires your parents' consent. Eudora just nodded cutely with her mouth half open. After this small interlude of accepting a disciple, the little archmage finally recovered from the frightening prophecy just now. After all, the person who said the prophecy was Eudora, not Professor Medea, so some people didn't take it too seriously. Moreover, prophets had always been mysterious. Many of the words they said contradicted the literal meaning. and there were many extremely exaggerated ones. Especially in recent years, sensational prophecies had become more and more frequent. In fact, there were still many people who cared. Professor Midya was obviously very clear. After she used the matter of accepting a disciple to divert some attention, she said casually, "Let's continue with the class. In the last class, we assigned an assignment on the interpretation of a one-sentence prophecy. I think everyone should already understand that the interpretation of a prophecy is a very personal thing. For example, Eudora probably just saw a painting of Bigaskar." There was some laughter in the classroom. Bigaskar was the main representative of contemporary abstract painters. He liked to use a large number of distorted color blocks like flowing water to lay the drawing paper. It was as if a composition would appear in the mind just by mentioning him. Black and white paint divided a piece of drawing paper into two halves horizontally. Black was the top, white was the bottom, and they were mixed with each other. The slanted yellow dots were the falling stars. The bright red arc was the flowing blood. The white blocks were the accumulation of corpses. At first glance, it seemed to be just a child's graffiti. Only after taking a closer look would one realize that it was really a child's graffiti. Professor Midya's casual remark had indeed played a big role. But there were still people who recorded the prophecy and carefully analyzed it. Dake was one of them. But the more they analyzed, the more they would discover. Eudora's prophecy was actually not much different from the alarmist words of the prophets in recent years. It was nothing more than the resurrection of the Demon King. And Dake knew. It was as if the storm caused by the wings of a butterfly was not enough to overturn everything. The Demon King would eventually be resurrected, and the brave would also step onto the stage. Just like the script of a stage opera, it was a set play. However, the changes in the era were destined to make it impossible to stir up a storm. At that time, they only needed to pour a cup of black tea, put on a few syrup pancakes, and do their job as a spectator. Watching from afar was the best contribution to this play. At least that was what he believed at the moment. The astronomy class had just begun, so it naturally would not end like this. After experiencing Eudora's divination, the students became more interested in the piece of night on the table. Professor Midya explained as he patrolled. In his heart, he was also thinking about Eudora's prophecy. Just from the prophecy itself, it was not surprising. It was even partially similar to the prophecy that she wanted to verify. But the problem was that there were too many similar prophecies. Prophets always predicted peace during war and war during peace because it was inevitable in the cycle of history. It was impossible for a prophecy to be wrong. And based on this kind of mentality, it was easier to see related things. Midya suddenly stopped. She saw that the knight in front of Saraswati had a more obvious change. "What did you see?" Midya asked softly. Sarah closed her eyes. After a moment she said, "It's fate." Midya was speechless. When the professor walked past her, Sarah quietly opened her eyes a little. She looked at her back and revealed a playful smile. Professor Midya immediately came to Ai Ma Metis's side. She found that Ai Ma was raising her hands and casting a spell on the knight like a witch from the old era. It actually caused some changes. Midya shook her head in amusement. 3 stars. Tonight, 9 stars will shine brightly. 6 stars left. Wow, it's coming. It's coming. Little Fatty Pitten's sudden outburst attracted Professor Midya's attention. She knocked the top of his head with the bat to make him quiet down. Silently, Luo Boat's eyes were filled with blood. White, who was racking his brains, suddenly noticed the change in the atmosphere around him. He wanted to wake up Luo Boat, but when he looked up and saw Professor Midya's smile, he quickly covered his mouth. The knight in front of Luo Boat rolled slightly. The edge of the knight gradually began to flow. Immediately afterward, Heidi, who was sitting at the same table with Sarah, also caught that little feeling. Then a person from the fool's house. 7 stars. Dake, who was teasing little Ivan, suddenly found that the atmosphere in the front row was a bit wrong. He suddenly raised his head. He saw that the night in front of Luo C was shining with countless stars. Dake subconsciously looked up at the sky. Through the ceiling, which was divided into hundreds of pieces, he could see the night sky. He looked down at the knight in front of Luosi. He finally realized that she also found that trace of feeling. Professor Midya walked over. She was not too surprised by Luosi Flotty's success. She had paid attention to Miss Flotty during the previous week's astronomy class. Flotty used to be one of the noblest surnames in the kingdom. But things changed with the passage of time. No matter how bright the stars were, there would be a time when they would fall. The collapse of the Flotty family had certain historical factors, but it also had a lot to do with its own ancient system. Since ancient times, the Flotty family had divided the main family and the branch family. The main family only had one bloodline, and the branch family would be demoted to a branch family. They would not be able to come in contact with any real inheritance. Once the bloodline of the main family died, the entire inheritance system would collapse in an instant. With the death of Luosi's parents, the fall of the Flotty family was inevitable. But tides rose and fell. Clouds gathered and dispersed. After a fall, there would be a rise. Professor Midya was a staunch fatalist. She always believed, a great man is born great, his fate is already determined. Halfway through class, the ninth star still did not appear. Professor Midya clapped her hands and did not wait any longer. Then now, the one who has seen fate, please interpret fate. Chapter 284. The talent of divination was far rarer than the talent of magic. But in such a classroom, there were more than 8 talents at the same time. Moreover, these 8 people were only the ones who had displayed their talents tonight. There were also many talents who were hidden among them and had yet to find the feeling. Professor Midya lit up the first star first. Then Saraswati, you go first. But after Sarah stood up, she did not move for a long time. Professor, divination is a very personal matter. Professor Midya blinked and casually said, no, what you see now is not considered divination. Unless you can be like Eudora. In fact, Eudora, who didn't know anything about her divination, couldn't help but look at Sarah blankly at this time. Sarah glanced at her sideways, then raised her head and said, okay then. I see the night surging like a tide. It's the time when the wind is blowing and the clouds are surging. I'm afraid there will be a disaster coming in the near future. Professor Midya clapped her hands and said, very good. Daring to make a judgment is the necessary quality of a prophet. Although there are many interpretations of this phenomenon, a prophet must first believe in their own prophecies. If they don't even believe in their own prophecies, it is even more impossible for others to believe. So, I think you need to be prepared to survive the disaster. Sarah. Remember it in 1 second. Midya. Next person. Aima Métis. Aima stood up slowly. She didn't know how Professor Midya saw that she had some foresight. That feeling was so faint that even she didn't know if it was an illusion or something. However, since he was called out by the professor, he had to say something. She pondered and said, Professor, I saw a shining star. Maybe it's the manifestation of wealth. Well, actually my wealth has always been good. Professor Midya tapped her magic wand lightly and said with a smile, that's really enviable. Aima sat down tentatively and found that the professor did not ask her to stand up and reinterpret. She was slightly relieved. At the moment when she hadn't learned anything, she really didn't know how to prophesy. Then next, the little magisters watched as Fate Seer was called out one by one. The envy in their hearts was written all over their faces. However, the students who were named were very troubled. Because they didn't really observe the future fragments like Eudora, they only saw a little bit of the most superficial omen. Trying to make a decent prophecy, with just a little change in the night projection was obviously difficult. The interpretation that was said after being named was mostly the product of racking one's brains. It was an imitation based on one's impression of the prophet. However, this was actually Professor Midya's request. Relying on limited information, he made plausible speculations. That was pretty much it. Luobot Broheim. Professor Midya called out Luobot's name. However, after Luobot stood up, he seemed very excited. He kept gesturing with his hands and said, I saw blood. Professor, perhaps I'll have a bloody calamity in the near future. Oh my God. I'm not one of the blood and corpses that Eudora mentioned, am I? Relax, Broheim. Professor Mitya blinked. What you need is to go to bed on time, stay healthy, and don't have a nosebleed. Luo Boat's mouth was half open and he couldn't speak for a long time. Professor Mitya tapped him with her magic wand and asked him to sit down. Okay, next. After Luo Boat, a student of the House of Fools was also forced to stand up and answer. No one knew what he saw. In short, after getting up, he stuttered for a long time. In the end, he didn't say anything and sat back down. It seemed that he was the kind of person who couldn't speak under the gaze of many people. If this kind of person wanted to be a prophet in the future, it would probably be very difficult. However, it was said that there were also people who lived behind the scenes for a long time. They didn't show up and didn't contact with guests. Instead, they only let their servants pass on prophecies to maintain a sense of mystery. After Professor Mitya said a few words to help him ease his emotions, she tapped on the 8th star that shone tonight. Next, Luo Siflati. Again and again, reading the future from omens is the destiny of us prophets. Although Luo Si had already guessed that she would be called, she was still quite nervous. She subconsciously looked at Deanna next to her. She wanted to draw strength from her best friend. Deanna was always so brave. In fact, she was very envious of her. Come on. Deanna clenched her fist and whispered. Luo Si slightly took a breath and looked at the podium. Under the gaze of all the students, she couldn't help but blush. However, after she spoke, her tone was still calm. She said, Professor, I saw the gradually increasing number of stars in the night sky, but I don't know what it means. Professor Mitya said softly, Don't be nervous. Think carefully about what you think in your heart. It will guide you to the correct interpretation. Luo Si hesitated slightly and didn't speak for a long time. Deanna quickly covered her mouth with her hand and whispered, Just make it up. Just make it up. Luo Si couldn't help but lower her head and look at her. Her eyes gradually widened. Deanna hurriedly winked at her. Only then did she say hesitantly, If the stars represent wishes, perhaps it means that my wishes will come true one after another? Professor Mitya encouraged her. Be confident. This is a very good prophecy, isn't it? Yes. Luo Si nodded slightly, and then sat down under Professor Mitya's signal. Then let's look for the 9th star that lit up tonight. Professor Mitya waved her wand and drew a fluorescent line. Then she pointed at the students one by one. Every student who was pointed at by her showed a trace of excitement and nervousness. However, the wand eventually moved away from them. In the end, after a long time, suddenly Mitya's eyebrows twitched. She noticed a strange fluctuation. Then, she suddenly turned her gaze from the direction of the white Gouda to the direction of the dake dimming in an instant. The silver moon in the depths of her eyes quickly receded, avoiding the fate of being blinded. Professor Mitya had always paid attention to this suspected son of the stars. If the 9th star tonight was him, then it would be logical. Then dake dimming. Did you see anything from tonight's moon? Dake was stunned. He couldn't help but look at the night sky projection on the table. After confirming that he didn't see anything, he stood up and said, Professor, I don't think I saw any changes. Was it embarrassing to not have the gift of divination? It wasn't embarrassing. Every time a real divination was performed, a price had to be paid. It wasn't as glamorous as it seemed on the surface. Dake didn't have much interest in becoming such a diviner. Of course, he was very interested in raising a divining Ivan. As expected, even Dake isn't omnipotent. When the junior magisters saw his calm expression, they couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. Luo Boat said to White, Look, I have the gift but Dake doesn't. White, I don't either. Luo Boat never hid his happiness. When he was called up to interpret the prophecy, he was a bit alarmed. Now he felt that it wasn't bad at all. Professor Mitya narrowed her eyes. She didn't withdraw her gaze because of Dake's words. She looked at the night sky projection on Dake's table. She keenly felt that some of the changes were intensifying. A diviner's observation was a personal action. In the eyes of outsiders, at most, they could see some vague phenomena caused by the observation. Only the diviner could truly see the changes clearly. Nowadays, The more common crystal ball divination could make the crystal ball produce images that others could see. However, that was actually a kind of illusion or camouflage. The goal was simply to make people believe, due to the personal nature of the observation. If a diviner wanted to make people believe in their prophecies, they had to use this kind of technique. If the observation was too small, even the vague phenomena wouldn't be produced. Just like the night sky projection in front of him. In the eyes of outsiders, there were no changes at all. However, some of the more brilliant prophets were still able to sense the unusual fluctuations. Without a doubt, Mitty had sensed it. She even wondered why Dake Dimming was lying. Then, was Dake Dimming really lying? If he knew what Professor Mitya was thinking at this moment, he might be even more excited. Just as he was about to sit down, some vague changes appeared in the night sky projection in front of him. He blinked and subconsciously rubbed the corners of his eyes. The edges of the night sky did indeed change. The edges that were gradually fusing into the air actually became solid. It was like a drawn outline, twisting like a tadpole. And in the night sky, there were vague changes in color. I found the feeling? Dake had a dumbfounded expression. Luobot, who had just been happy about his uniqueness, smacked his lips after a long while. As expected of Dake, White's gaze became even more envious. The other students were more or less the same. But Dake's gaze had already shifted to fantasy beast, Ivan, who was leaning against the stand. He immediately discovered that Ivan was closely staring at the night sky. The atmosphere was unusual. He immediately realized. He wasn't the one who had found the feeling. Peeking at fate, please interpret fate. Professor Mitya reminded him with a smile on her face. Dake adjusted his expression, but his gaze was still moving back and forth between little Ivan and the night sky. He couldn't make up his mind. At this time, should he just casually make up a line? Or should he honestly admit that tonight's ninth star was a magic guide sprite? Although magic guide sprites with prophecy, sure kill skills did exist. But having a sure kill skill and learning prophecy were two completely different things. Dake's magic guide sprite had already shown a relatively high IQ in the duel. But he still forbade the Diru beast and the little fiend from speaking in front of outsiders in order to limit people's speculations about its high IQ. Now if little Ivan was exposed, no. There was another problem he needed to pay attention to. If he lied, he might not be able to hide it from Professor Mitya. Moreover, was there a need to lie? It didn't seem so. While Dark was thinking about this, after Professor Mitya carefully sensed the source of the fluctuations, she found the source of the fluctuations. Her eyes couldn't help but reveal a trace of unconcealable astonishment. From the beginning of the class, she had been very curious as to why Dake Dimming had placed such a magic guide card on the table. Now, she seemed to finally understand a little. But this was just too shocking. Professor Mitya's reaction was very fast. She didn't even wait for Dake to speak and said, "Of course, some fates can't be spoken. If student Dimming is willing, you can talk to me after class." How could Dake not see that she was giving him a way out? He nodded and said, "Thank you, Professor." The astronomy class continued. Professor Mitya finally began to teach some theoretical basic content. Because there were no textbooks, she specially reminded the students to take good notes. Of course, there were also people who were naturally rebellious and didn't want to take notes. But on the whole, the students were still very serious. It was mainly because of the performance of Eudora and the others, which made many people have a strong interest in divination. At 9 p.m. sharp, with the sound of the bell, this week's astronomy class finally came to an end. After Professor Mitya finished assigning the homework, she put on her witch hat. But this time she didn't leave in a carriage. Instead, she said to the audience, "Eudora and Wei and Dake Dimming, stay for a while." Dark slowed down the speed of packing up his things. Deanna said excitedly, "Then we'll go first." Dake raised his head and said, "Okay." Deanna pulled Luosi out of the door. On the other side, when Eudora saw that Dake was also left behind, her cheeks were slightly red. She trembled slightly and suppressed her excitement. After the students who wanted to stay in the classroom to join in the fun were chased away by Professor Mitya, the surrounding environment was instantly deserted. Professor Mitya raised her magic wand and pointed at the ceiling. The ceiling closed and covered the night sky. She walked to the podium, looked at Eudora first and said softly, "How is it? Can you give me an answer now?" Eudora bit her lips nervously and squeezed out a mosquito-like voice. "Professor, I'm very willing to be your student, but I still need my parents' consent." Mitya smiled. "Don't worry. As long as you are willing, your parents will not disagree." She was confident. Then Mitya walked towards Dake and looked at the magical illusion beast, Ivan in his hand. The silver moon in the depths of her eyes appeared again. The feeling this magic elf card gave her was getting more and more strange. She said bluntly, "Dimming, your magic elf?" Dake grinned and said, "Yes, Professor. As you can see, I think it has a talent for divination." 2-in-1 forced. "I'm sorry for the mistake. Think of a way to make up for it today." Chapter 285. A magic fairy with the gift of divination. If she hadn't seen it with her own eyes, Mitya wouldn't have believed such a ridiculous thing. But at this moment, the truth was right in front of her eyes. She had no choice but to believe it. "Let me take a look." Mitya bent down. Her heavy heart could not help but hang high in the air. The gully of her thoughts was snow-white and deep. Dake quickly looked away and placed, magical fantasy beast, Ibu on his palm. Inside the magic card, little Ibu tilted its head and looked at the old auntie curiously. Mitya suddenly felt a trace of disrespect and couldn't help but frown. But after a moment of careful observation, she couldn't see anything other than the intelligence of the magic fairy being higher than 3.0. "Can you summon it?" Mitya asked hesitantly. Website. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. Dake nodded. "Of course." Then he raised the magic card and chanted the summoning spell. Ibu-chan cheered and jumped out of the magic card. Its body quickly grew bigger, and it threw itself into Dake's arms like a fur ball. Dake leaned back and hugged it. Then he held its belly and turned it to Professor Mitya. Although Mitya had the honor of observing Dake's magic fairy during the newcomers' competition, she was shocked at the time. Only now did she have the chance to observe it closely. She narrowed her eyes and stared at little Ibu-chan's eyes. The eyes were the windows to the soul. Prophets especially liked to peek into people's hearts through their eyes. But after a while Mitya sighed. Ibu-chan's eyes were unbelievably clear. It was like a newborn baby. There was only curiosity about the outside world, and longing for its mother. It was like a real life form, not a man-made creation like the magic guide fairies. A little mage who could refine such a magic fairy. If not for Dake's strong background and being in the Shungmalian Academy, she would have been swallowed by the huge greed. Even she couldn't hold herself back at this moment. She really wanted to eat him up. Professor Mitya stood up and said, "Do you know what it saw from the night projection?" Dake blinked and looked at little Ibu. "One who has seen fate, please interpret it." Ivi. Dake shrugged and looked at Professor Mitya. "Professor, I hope you understand." Professor Mitya laughed heartily. "I heard that when the bond between you and a magical elf reaches a certain level, you will be able to hear each other's thoughts. Looks like you're still lacking." Dake. "Professor, I'm just a first-year student." Professor Mitya sighed. "You don't look like a first-year student." Then she said, "How about this? Since your magic guiding fairy really has a talent for divination, I'll allow it to sit in on the astronomy class. But can it really understand me?" Dake lowered his head and asked, "So Ibu-chan, do you understand?" Evie immediately shook his head like a rattledrum. Dake smiled. "It says it understands." Evie. Woo. Eudora covered her face and watched the interaction between Dake and Evie the entire time. Her cheeks were burning with envy. Dake finally noticed her and couldn't help but ask, "Professor, what price did Eudora pay for her first prophecy?" Professor Mitya smiled and wanted to find a reason to get away with it, but she noticed that Eudora was also looking over. Eudora said timidly, "Professor Bartholomew, I want to know too." Mitya looked left and right at Dake and Eudora, and suddenly came to a realization. She took out her magic wand and waved it at the empty space. As the two shadows rushed out, The iconic pumpkin carriage appeared in the fluorescent light. Professor Mitya pointed at the carriage and said, "Let's talk somewhere else." Eudora was still puzzled. Dake's expression was solemn. Professor Mitya's cautious attitude made him feel that something was wrong. So he no longer hesitated and said to Eudora, "Let's go." Only then did Eudora climb onto the board of the carriage. After Dake got on, she lifted the curtain and walked into the carriage. Dake followed closely behind. As soon as they entered the carriage, the light outside suddenly disappeared. The interior of the carriage seemed to be a completely independent space. Only a little starlight decorated the top of the carriage. It was an exceptionally bright star map. Looking up, it made people feel as if they were falling into the starry sky. Dake sat down 2 seats away from Eudora and waited quietly. Eudora was obviously a little nervous and kept poking each other with her fingers. A moment later, Professor Mitya also lifted the curtain and walked into the carriage. She pointed outside and the 2 beasts condensed from black shadows drove out of the classroom with the carriage. They flew into the night sky and gradually merged into the night. When the pumpkin carriage disappeared in the air, Professor Mitya sat beside Eudora. The atmosphere gradually became solemn. "Professor." Dake broke the silence. "If you have anything to say, just say it." Professor Mitya waved at Eudora and asked her to come closer. Then, she took out a mirror from the secret compartment of the carriage. The light emitted from the back of the mirror illuminated the entire carriage. Eudora saw herself in the mirror and subconsciously lowered her head. Professor Mitya said softly, "A true prophet must have the confidence to face everything head-on. Raise your head and look at the mirror carefully." Eudora's toes suddenly clenched. Her right hand grabbed the index finger of her left hand. After taking a light breath, she suddenly raised her head. Reflected in the mirror was a cute girl with a pink doll head. In terms of looks alone, she had sufficient confidence. "Open your eyes and observe carefully." Professor Mitya's voice sounded in her ears. Eudora couldn't help but move. She tried her best to open her eyes wide, and suddenly noticed a golden star in her right eye flashing suddenly. "This is," Dake, who had already turned around, immediately caught the shining golden star. However, he still didn't know what this meant, so he could only ask, "Professor, is this serious?" "I don't know if it's serious or not, but it's very troublesome." Mitya shook her head and said, "Prophets pay a variety of prices during divination, but there is one price that is very troublesome. We call it Death Omen Star." Dake said in surprise, "Death Omen Star?" Professor Mitya said, "The so-called Death Omen Star is an unlucky star that symbolizes death. It doesn't necessarily appear in the form of a star. However, prophets who pay this price will have an additional Death Omen Star on their body every time they perform a divination. The more Death Omen Star there are, the closer they are to death. We can't know what the limit of Death Omen Star is. Maybe 2, maybe 3. Dake quickly understood and couldn't help but gasp. "Doesn't this mean that every divination is a gamble of life?" Professor Mitya nodded and said, "You can understand it that way." Dake couldn't help but glance at Eudora and then said, "Professor, if that's the case, then she should stay away from divination, not?" Mitya said helplessly, "I know what you mean." But after the clairvoyant's first divination, there was no turning back. Sometimes, a sudden divination was not something that could be controlled by one's will. It was a kind of guidance from the unseen world. We call it apocalypse. Dake, apocalypse. Mitya, yes, apocalypse. Many prophets spend their entire lives trying to get an apocalypse. However, we who have the eyes of stars will always receive extra favor from fate. Heavenly revelations aren't rare to prophets who possess the eye of the stars. Dake couldn't help but frown. If you want to wear the crown, you must bear the weight. The eyes of stars was a gift from heaven. With the eyes of stars, one could take big strides forward on the path of prophets and touch the realm that ordinary people could not reach. However, they also needed to bear the responsibility of being bestowed by heaven. In other words, they had to bear the apocalypse. An uncontrollable apocalypse meant an uncontrollable price to pay, especially for prophets whose price was the Death Omen Star. Every apocalypse was a life and death judgment. Eudora had already embarked on this path, so there was no way to avoid it. In such a situation, it was better to take advantage of the situation and become a prophet. Instead of living in the shadows, it was better to sacrifice herself for glory. However, this was too cruel for an 11-year-old girl. Professor Mitya decisively announced the acceptance of her as a disciple in the classroom. It was probably because of this consideration. Dake took a deep breath and probed. Since this is a problem that has been accumulating for a long time, haven't the prophets of the Star Tower tried to solve it? Mitya shook her head. Other than gradually mastering the operating law of astrology during the learning process, and avoiding using divination outside of Apocalypse, there is no other way. Although that was the case, there was actually a way. And it was easy to think of. Since the final price of the Death Omen Star was death, then as long as one could successfully avoid death, one could carry the Death Omen Star and divine to their heart's content. In other words, becoming an undying species was a way to solve it. Whether it was zombies, liches, or ghosts, they could perfectly ignore the price of the Death Omen Star. But in fact, if one really became an undying species because of this, then the change in life form was likely to cause the price of divination to change. Fate was never friendly to peepers. Am I going to die? Just as Dake was deep in thought about this, Eudora, who had been listening by the side, suddenly burst out with this sentence. Professor Mitya quickly comforted her. Of course not. You will become a great prophet. Eudora muttered. I just want to be more useful. Mitya. You will. Eudora and Mitya chatted in a low voice. Dake chose to listen. Professor Mitya would go to Sister Kalyan next and ask her to perform a full-body examination on Eudora to prevent other hidden costs. Moreover, Professor Mitya was also going to ask Sister Kalyan to concoct a bottle of eye drops to cover the golden star in Eudora's eyes. However, this cover was only on the surface. Professor Mitya might start from another aspect, by artificially guiding the change in the price to avoid the Death Omen Star. However, Dake could no longer participate in the conversation after that. Moreover, it was not suitable for him to continue traveling together. Therefore, at 10 o'clock in the evening, Dake got off the carriage and temporarily separated from Professor Mitya and Eudora. He hugged little Ivan tightly in his arms and looked at the disappearing pumpkin carriage. After a faint sigh, he turned around and left. Dake, who returned to the dormitory, extracted all the prophecies from tonight and wrote them on a page. Then, he took out a form that was used to learn how to pronounce the words. Using the dumbest method, he tried to pronounce the words one by one until Abuza-chan finally wrote down the changes in the curtain of the night that it saw tonight. It was not a drastic change. In conclusion, many pitch-black tentacles that looked like tadpoles had grown out of the night. They were shivering in the wind like kelp, and they were all over the place. As for what the scene meant, Dake tried to interpret it, but he always felt that it was meaningless to interpret it, so he put it aside for the time being. It was like writing an entire page of interpretation of the prophecies tonight, but it was useless. The only useful thing was Eudora's prophecy, and the more he thought about it, the deeper the meaning. The stars will fall, the sky will collapse, the day will no longer be day, the night will no longer be night, and the gods will no longer be gods. Don't think in the direction of the resurrection of the Demon King. But only one word to describe it. Without a doubt, this is the dusk of the gods. However, the dusk of the gods had already happened in an unknown era. According to the literature, during the dusk of the gods, all the gods were thrown into the world's big boiler like dumplings and were cooked in a few minutes. In short, it was such an era. But if we forcefully interpret it in this direction, before the dusk of the gods, is there a segment called the awakening of the gods? Thinking of the resurrection of the moon goddess last semester, Dake felt his scalp go numb. If there was a similar segment, then it was very likely to be a structure that transcended the original work. After all, the original work was largely a dating game limited to the Academy, but that did not mean that the plot of the original work was the entire development of the world. Hypothetically, we are just hypothetically, the awakening and fall of the demon god at the end of the original work was just the prelude to a great era. Dake chose to sleep. on the same night. Although the first-year students said that they didn't care, that it was just SOSO, that it wasn't credible, and so on, when they really had nightmares, they were all sneaky. On the contrary, after receiving Sister Kalien's examination and Professor Midya's counseling, Eudora, because she felt an unexpected degree of concern and worry from Dake tonight, she had a beautiful dream that was not suitable to be made public. 2-in-1. Chapter 286. He woke up from a dream. Dake suddenly opened his eyes. His back was wet and cold, and his chest was heavy. He couldn't help but gasp for air. But after taking a deep breath, he silently pulled out little Ivan, who had curled up into a ball of fur, from the bulging bedding. His chest immediately felt much better. Yawn, Dake lightly yawned and quietly got out of bed. After a month and a half, school life gradually got back on track. The 3 new professors also slowly integrated into the lives of the little magisters. It was no longer strange for them to occasionally run into each other in the castle after class. Dake wrapped himself in a scarf and ran from the 2nd floor of the castle to the 1st floor according to the usual route. He then made a big circle and returned to the tower. His muscles and bones were relaxed. The aroma of milk floated out of the window and into the air. Sheng Malian welcomed a new day full of vitality. Remember the website, MFIP VIP. The first class on Thursday began with Professor Li in a fit of pique. She divided the homework handed in by the students from the previous class into 2 stacks on the podium. Then she puffed up her cheeks and looked at the students below. The atmosphere suddenly became stagnant. "Ai ma." "Yes." Ai ma stood up with a puzzled expression. Professor Li handed over the stack of papers on the right. "Help me distribute the homework." "Yes, Professor." Ai ma let out a sigh of relief. She took the papers and began to distribute them. Then only the stack of papers on the left was left on the podium. Professor Li picked up the stack of papers and called out the first name. Luobot Broheim. Luobot suddenly quivered and subconsciously sat up straight. Professor Li shook the papers. "Come and get it." Luobot walked through the aisle and walked up to the podium. Professor Li handed over his own paper. After Luobot took it, he said casually, "Deduct 5 marks." Luobot's body stiffened. His foot, which had just taken a step forward, was suspended in the air. The refining experiment of the Sure Kill skill card had just ended and the first-year students' credit limit was tight. Even if there were some leftovers, they would use them for the next experiment. 5 points were deducted in one go, which was more or less heart-wrenching. More importantly, Luobot hadn't had any credits deducted in a long time. This was the complete opposite of his bad situation last semester, where he had his credits deducted at every turn. He was, in fact, rather pleased about it. However, since his credits had already been deducted, it was impossible to get them back. He could only watch as they slipped through his fingers. Luobot didn't ask anything because the test paper in his hand was the best answer. The test paper was filled with red XS. Luobot brushed past the next person and returned to his seat. White asked with concern, "Luobot, what happened?" Luobot spread the test paper on the table and smiled bitterly. "I didn't do my homework well. But what can I do? I don't know how to do it." White's mouth couldn't help but twitch. Because he didn't know how to do it either. The 2 of them did their homework together. Although they didn't copy each other's work, they were very clear about each other's situation. Sure enough, White was called up not long after. "White Gouda, 5 points deducted." He held the points deducted in his mouth, as if he was holding back tears. The students with poor homework were called up to the podium in turn, and had their points deducted one by one. Most of them were students from the Knight Institute. Most of the students from the Aristocrat Institute were safe and sound. With the aisle as the dividing line, the atmosphere between the 2 institutes was completely different. The students from the Aristocrat Institute looked at the students from the Knight Institute, who were called up as if they were watching a show. The students from the Knight Institute almost ground their teeth to pieces when they realized that almost no one from the Aristocrat Institute was called up to the podium. Originally, if everyone's homework was bad, it would be Professor Lily's turn to reflect on herself. However, if only a small portion of the students did poorly, it would make people wonder if they weren't paying attention to the lecture. Even though Professor Lily was actually throwing a tantrum. However, the reason for the deduction of points was ironclad. Many people simply scribbled on the test paper to cope with the situation. They didn't have the courage to complain even if they wanted to. Fortunately, Professor Lily didn't say anything else after the deduction of points. She just started to talk about the test paper step by step. The way she explained the content of the test paper was easier to understand than the way she explained it directly. However, if one didn't even understand that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, how could they understand that 1 plus 1 is equal to 1 times 2 equals 2? The atmosphere of the arithmetic class was dull. It gave people the feeling of a hot summer day that they couldn't breathe. After Professor Lily finished talking about the test paper, she continued with the class. Even though she already knew that some people didn't understand, this was the way of teaching. She couldn't just start over because of a small portion of people. If the students really didn't understand, they could start from scratch. They could also ask their classmates for help after class, or they could directly ask the teacher for help. If they didn't even have the initiative to do this, then sometimes the teacher couldn't be blamed. In short, this class passed by in a fog. At the end of the class, Professor Lily gave out another test paper as homework. She still wanted to deepen the students' understanding of the content of the lecture through answering the questions. The second class was Introduction to Magic. Professor Zaire first summarized the collective failure of the previous class. Then, based on the performance of the students in the newcomers competition, he called a few of them to the podium and performed a demonstration of remote transmission and control of magic. However, he was surprised to find that other than Deanna, who had already demonstrated remote control of the magic ball in the competition, the other students had more or less mastered it. No, he quickly noticed. Even the rest of the students besides those few students had some foundation. How did they do it? Although the average talent of this year's cohort is better than the previous cohort, it's not to the extent of overturning the previous cohort. Professor Zaire couldn't help but be a little distracted. Then, on the way to continue teaching, he finally found the secret of how the students gradually mastered this high-end technique. At some point in time, it started. Everyone in the classroom was practicing a technique called pen spin all the time. Under the premise of having the necessary talent, remote transmission and control of magic was originally something that could be practiced. It was just that some people needed to practice for a year and a half to master it, while others only needed a few weeks. The magic ring that Professor Zaire gave to Dake for Christmas was a tool that was specially used to practice this technique. However, at this moment, Professor Zaire suddenly discovered that pen spin seemed to be able to let people take the initiative to participate. After mastering a little, they could even unconsciously continue to practice with super high intensity. This was the so-called teaching with fun. He couldn't help but sigh. The importance of proper education was indeed great. After that, he began to seriously consider whether it was necessary to take the initiative to promote the pen spin in the academy. For the time being, let's not talk about Professor Lily's troubles and Professor Zaire's considerations. In the history of magic class in the afternoon, Professor Ryan Hux, after several adjustments, once again talked about the history of the war against the demons that he had personally experienced. He still couldn't control his emotions well in this aspect, and occasionally showed his irritable side. Just like the hair on the top of his head, somehow it turned into an afro. The students all knew that he had become Sister Kalian's guinea pig for hair growth, but they still couldn't help but snicker secretly. The next day, Friday, after Professor Cheongxi's dual class, the little magisters finally welcomed the third class of magic beasts since the start of the school term. As early as Wednesday noon, they had already handed in last week's homework. Choose a relatively common magic beast in the dungeon to analyze and write a small paper. Professor Nini announced that she would choose a magic beast from the homework as the topic of this week's class, so the students were already full of anticipation before the class started. Although the psychic beasts in the first 2 weeks were scary, after the 2 psychic beasts self-destructed in a row, it left a funny impression. I wonder what kind of magic beast the topic of this class will be. Deanna was still thinking about her mushroom bear, and Luosi was thinking about whether he would get his furry rabbit. Dake looked at the clock on the wall, and also thought about his topic. There were many magic beasts that were relatively common in the dungeon. The more well-known ones were slimes, goblins, ogres, trolls, dryads, kobolds. Look, just the name alone is very familiar, laughs. Magic beasts like the psychic beasts were also considered common, but for people who didn't really come into contact with the dungeon, they weren't that well known. When Dake was learning about the production of zoo, he also studied the secret record of birds and beasts, so he knew more than ordinary people. For this topic, he chose a magic beast that wasn't that well known, but there were a lot of them in the dungeon, the vine monster. When adventurers entered the dungeon, they would always see vines hanging all over the walls in different levels. Those vines either emitted a strange fragrance or emitted light. They had all kinds of characteristics that attracted other creatures. Usually they would lure people or magic beasts over, and then instantly pounce on them and entangle them to hunt. The vine monster was very dangerous and difficult to identify. Adventurers always confused them with the vines, and if they were not careful, they would be killed. When the vine monster's body was cut open, sticky blood would be found flowing in its vine-like body. They looked like plants, but they were actually animals. Not only did they have blood vessels, but they also had mouth parts that were full of fine teeth. But if one knew them well enough, after cutting off the head and tail, peeling off the skin, and draining the blood, the remaining meat was soft and delicate. Put it in boiling water, and it could be eaten in a few minutes. It was a rare edible species in the dungeon. Maybe it was because she had read Dake's little paper, but before the bell rang, Professor Nini brought a fat chicken in. The fat chicken's eyes were covered by a black cloth, and the rest of the chicken's body was tied up like a rice dumpling. At first, the little magisters were still guessing why Professor Nini brought a fat chicken in, until half of a snake's head came out of the hemp rope that tied the chicken. The little magisters in the front row who had some knowledge were suddenly frightened. Ai Ma, who was usually very reserved, even screamed. Compared to the surrounding students who didn't know much, Ai Ma recognized the magic beast almost immediately, so she was even more frightened. The classroom was suddenly in chaos because of the students' fright. The little magisters in the front row even ran out of their seats and fled to the back row of the classroom. Professor Nini was frightened by the actions of the little magisters and didn't know what to do. She shook her head in panic and looked around. Finally, she had an idea and quickly hid the magic beast in her hand behind her back. Then, she raised her hand and scratched her head with a silly smile on her face. Hey. It was as if nothing had happened. Nothing has happened between you and me. A boy from the magic department said in horror. Professor Nini, how could you bring a snake-foul beast into the classroom? I'm going to tell the principal. Professor Nini glanced at him with a guilty conscience. She recognized that he was a student who almost peed himself during the experience of the soul-sucking monster, so she couldn't help but look away. It was her fault for scaring the child, but she didn't do it on purpose. It was just a normal lecture. She gathered her courage and tried to say, Everyone, can you calm down a little bit? Actually, it's not what you think. Ai Ma's forehead was covered in cold sweat. While subconsciously protecting Susan and Lucy behind her, she said loudly, Professor Nini, that's a snake-foul beast, right? The legendary magic beast that will turn into stone when it looks at you? After hearing Ai Ma's words, Professor Nini quickly shook her head and said, No, it's not a snake-foul beast, it's a cockatrice beast. It's a snake, not a chicken. Who cares about you? A loud voice from the Academy of Knights suddenly roared. Whether it's a chicken or a snake, does it have anything to do with its ability to turn people into stone? No way. Professor Nini subconsciously pulled the cockatrice beast out from behind her. She pointed at the narrow black cloth covering the corn's eyes with her thick fingers and argued loudly. As long as the eyes are covered with cloth, it won't turn people into stone. However, another girl from the Academy of Magic pointed at the cockatrice beast and said in horror, It's coming out. The snake's head is coming out. It's not covered. The eyes are not covered. Professor Nini followed her gaze and looked down. The cockatrice beast's head had indeed come out from the gap of the hemp rope. It was shaking its head and spitting out its tongue. Professor Nini quickly reached out and pinched its tongue, desperately explaining, "Don't worry, the snake's eyes can't turn people into stone." "Ah!" Another girl screamed. "It's falling off." "Professor Nini, that cloth is falling off?" Professor Nini asked in confusion. "Which cloth?" The girl said, "The cloth covering the corn's eyes." Oh. Thus, she put the cockatrice beast down and looked up at its chicken head. The cloth covering the eyes of the cockatrice beast slid off, revealing one of the corn's eyes. A sharp glint flashed in the eye of the chicken, as it shot out a gray ray. Professor Nini's face was hit by the ray at a very close distance. A layer of gray stone immediately climbed onto the surface of her skin. This scene made the students' guts shatter, and the fear they had been suppressing exploded in an instant. The whole classroom was in chaos amidst the screams. Dake stood up subconsciously. However, the petrification on Professor Nini's face only spread to the tip of her nose, and then it suddenly stopped. Dense cracks even appeared on the gray stone shell. Then, with two kacha sounds, it shattered and fell to the ground. Professor Nini touched her cheek, which seemed to have become smoother, and said with an innocent face, "Look! Look, nothing happened to him at all." 2-in-1/4/200. Please give me a monthly vote. Chapter 287. The Shattered Stone Shell. The stone powder all over the floor. Professor Nini's innocent little expression. All of this finally eased the tense atmosphere that filled the classroom. The students in the front row quieted down and carefully observed the cockatrice beast in Professor Nini's hand. Although they still had lingering fears, they were no longer as panicked as they were at the beginning. The cockatrice beast was slightly different from the soul suckers. They were both dangerous monsters that were more commonly seen in the underground city. However, the cockatrice beast was far more famous than the soul suckers. It looked like a monster that was pieced together by a rooster and a snake. There was a legend that it could turn its enemies into stone with just its gaze. What happened just now proved the authenticity of the legend. However, Professor Nini, who had the bloodline of the behemoth, seemed to have a very strong resistance to the petrification ray. She was almost completely immune to the petrification judgment. This slightly reduced the students' fear of the cockatrice beast. 1 second to remember https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. However, many people subconsciously ignored it. Professor Nini was immune to petrification, but it didn't mean that they were immune to petrification. Fortunately, Professor Nini didn't forget to retie the strip of cloth. "Alright everyone, return to your seats. I think that since Professor Nini brought such a dangerous monster into the classroom, she should have prepared a corresponding countermeasure. For example, the petrification antidote?" Dake's calm and clear voice came from the back row. The students finally calmed down. AI Ma Métis looked up at Professor Nini and asked carefully, "Professor Nini, is it like this?" Professor Nini, who was on the podium, seemed to have only just remembered this. She quickly pushed the cockatrice beast aside and reached into her small bag, with her free hand to take out a large jar. The large glass jar was filled with an unknown dark green liquid. It didn't look like a proper petrification antidote. However, Professor Nini shook the jar and tried to say loudly, "This is the saliva of the lime toad, the nemesis of the cockatrice beast. Just 1 drop of this saliva can make a liter of potion that can remove the petrification caused by the cockatrice beast." Phew, although the dark green saliva didn't look very reliable and was a little disgusting, it was still a special medicine against the cockatrice beast. Aima breathed a sigh of relief and led her 2 desk mates back to their seats. With her taking the lead, the boys and girls of the Knights Academy began to move. The students from the other academies also returned after a short while. The classroom finally regained some order. Dake also sat down in the back seat. During the first 2 classes, he knew that although Professor Nini looked a little naive, she would do her best to make the necessary preparations. Looking at it now, it was indeed the case. With the help of the special medicine, petrification was no longer so frightening. In myths and legends, Petrification was always described as incomprehensible and terrifying. The more famous one was the legend of Medusa. But in fact, in the long war against the demons, humans had already invented a way to resist petrification. When Professor Nini saw that the students had returned to their seats, she couldn't help but look at Dake with gratitude. Then, she held the cockatrice beast in one hand and the toad's saliva in the other, walked to the back of the desk and resumed her lecture. Actually, the cockatrice beast isn't such a frightening monster. Apart from the petrification ray that can petrify people, they only have the combat power of a big rooster and half a snake. Moreover, with the lower half of a rooster's body, the cockatrice beast has lost some of the characteristics of a snake. It's even less dangerous than a snake. Many of the magical beasts in the dungeon are like that. Their danger is based on the unknown. Once you understand them well enough and make proper preparations before coming into contact with them, you can greatly reduce the danger, and even turn it into a reward for your adventures in the dungeon. For example, the cockatrice beast not only has the body of a rooster, but also the body of a snake. This means, can anyone tell me what this means? As Professor Nini spoke, she suddenly seemed to realize that she needed to interact with the students. She abruptly stopped at a certain part of the lecture. Then, she looked eagerly at the audience, hoping that some students would raise their hands to answer the question. However, this question seemed to be out of their scope. Even the students from the School of Magic did not know how to answer. After a long while, a girl from the School of Magic could not bear to see her like this. She carefully raised her hand. Professor Nini's eyes lit up, and she hurriedly called her up. The girl said softly, "Speaking of rewards, the cockatrice beast with the body of a snake and a rooster means that we can collect the body parts of both the snake and rooster at the same time." She was still worried that she was talking nonsense. Professor Nini nodded vigorously and said, "That's right. This means that we can eat both chicken and snake meat." The girl was instantly stunned. But Professor Nini had already taken the opportunity to continue. In the buried city, if you want to explore for a long time, learning how to find food is very important. I remember that someone mentioned the vine monster in the homework that you handed in. The blood of the vine monster can be used to quench thirst in an emergency. Its meat is soft and delicate. It can be eaten after cooking. The taste is a little bland, but with seasoning. Another student mentioned the mushroom bear. The mushrooms of the mushroom bear are edible fungi, and they are very big and in large portions. Similarly, the cockatrice beast is also an edible species. As long as the head and tail are removed, the cockatrice beast will be far more delicious than the vine monster and the mushroom bear. By the way, although they look more like chickens, they are actually snakes. The part that belongs to the snake is the head, and the part that belongs to the rooster is the tail. Well, in today's lesson, in addition to introducing the cockatrice beast, there will also be a petrification experience. I wonder if anyone wants to try it? Don't worry. As long as the petrification is removed within 15 minutes, there won't be any sequelae. After saying that, she looked eagerly at the audience again. However, this time was completely different from the previous one. All the students looked away. No one responded to her out of sympathy. Oh my God. Forget about the soul-sucking monster's soul-sucking experience. After all, it was really necessary. What the hell was this petrification experience? After experiencing it once, could it be that one would be immune to petrification? Are you kidding me? Not everyone was a behemoth. Mass immunity wouldn't work here. Professor Nini, who had been ostracized by the group, looked at AI Ma and Dake for help. However, this time, AI Ma turned her head directly and rejected her without mercy. Professor Nini could only look at the golden-haired young man in the corner of the last row. Dake took a deep breath and felt that it was not good to be in a deadlock like this. He stood up and said, "Professor Nini, the petrification experience is indeed not necessary. If we encounter it suddenly, it will be difficult for us to take out the potion before we are completely petrified. If we are on guard, we just need to cover our bodies with inorganic materials, and we don't have to worry about being petrified. The best way to deal with the cockatrice beast is to have a companion by your side." Professor Nini looked curious. "What's non-organic material?" "Dake, a non-vegetarian chicken. Professor Nini. Question mark. Dake. Just kidding. Anyway, instead of having a petrification experience in class, why don't we explain which parts of the cockatrice beast are the most delicious? The explanation in this aspect was not only useful but also useful. It could also reduce the students' fear of the cockatrice beast. In the underground city, calmness and composure were more important than anything else. After that, Professor Nini listened to Dake's opinion and dissected the cockatrice beast on the spot. That scene. Let's not talk about it. It was not until the second half of the class that Professor Nini successfully roasted the meat of the cockatrice beast in high spirits that the students felt less nauseous. So, who on earth chose the cockatrice beast as the assignment for the last class? The white Gouda applied for exemption from responsibility. The assignment for this magical beast class was to write a small paper on the topic of the cockatrice beast. After assigning the assignment, Professor Nini couldn't wait to run away with the roasted meat. The saliva dripping from the corner of her mouth had already revealed her deepest desire. Hey, Deanna wants to try it too. Deanna looked at the cockatrice beast roasted meat disappearing at the door of the classroom, and couldn't help but look depressed. Then let's have chicken for lunch today. Dake said casually. Deanna nodded hard and said, let's have chicken. The chicken was out of stock in the cafeteria for lunch today. In short, today's Magical Beasts class was also very interesting. The initial shock had become the topic of conversation after the meal, especially the dissection and cooking in class, which was probably something that the little magisters would never have thought of. They ate the chicken with great relish, and were looking forward to next week's Magical Beasts class. Not long after the meal, the passage to Traveler's Street finally opened. Dake had been waiting for this moment for a long time, so he had already entered Traveler's Street with the flow of people just after 12 o'clock. His purpose was, of course, to buy more basic materials for refining the Sure-Kill skill card. Dake already had a lot of experience in refining the Sure-Kill skill, drinking milk. He only needed a lot of experiments to get close to perfection. As for refining the Sure-Kill skill, transformation, he had to put it aside for the time being since he only had one magic beast hair left. One strand of magic beast fur was worth 1,000 credits. That was a little too expensive. Even he couldn't afford it. His current plan was to refine the Sure-Kill skill, drinking milk many times and increase his proficiency before challenging the Sure-Kill skill, transformation. But today, as soon as he entered Traveler's Street, a sour stench rushed into his face. He saw that Traveler's Street, which had been fine last week, had suddenly turned into a pink hell this week. Whether it was the pink ribbons that covered the eaves, the various pink panels that were spread out in front of the shops, or the hearts that filled Traveler's Street, it was as if they were announcing the arrival of an important festival. It was only at this time that Dake suddenly realized that wasn't there still nearly a month before Valentine's Day on February 14th? Aren't these shops a little too eager to harvest leeks? Dake couldn't help but mutter. Then, he saw two familiar figures slip into the chocolate workshop. On the outside of the chocolate workshop, there were clear words written in flamboyant font. Learn how to make chocolate quickly. Learn quickly in 2 days. Guaranteed mastery. Clearly, the classroom didn't reveal any related atmosphere at all, but the first-year students who were gradually becoming more sensitive to this had already begun to secretly arm themselves. A war without gunpowder had already revealed its magnificence. The children's growth was rapid. The Halloween ball. The Christmas ball. It was enough to teach them what a single dog was. Since they didn't catch the wind of the Halloween ball, nor did they catch the tail of the Christmas ball, they couldn't show their weakness on Valentine's Day. And Valentine's Day had a very good custom. They didn't need to worry about whether there would be a response or not. On the other hand, White Day and Valentine's Day were separated by a whole month. People gave gifts on Valentine's Day and received gifts on White Day. There was a whole month gap between these two events. Even if they didn't receive a gift in the end, it wasn't easy to be remembered by others. And it wouldn't be embarrassing. As for those who wanted to publicly confess on Valentine's Day, he could only wish them to die on the spot. Dake had always had a bad impression of this so-called Valentine's Day. Chocolate and roses and a sense of ritual. It was tiring in all aspects. Two parallel lines were forcibly twisted and crossed together, but in the end, they would still go further and further away. It was too deliberate. Unfortunately, everything in life was deliberate. If you couldn't transcend, you could only compromise. Time eroded, and the road was long. You still had to learn to accept it. This year's Valentine's Day, I'm afraid a cabinet will be emptied. Walking on the street full of ribbons and hearts, Dake skillfully bought all kinds of materials, and even received some letters and small cards as gifts. Before dinner, Dake returned to the dorm with big and small bags. Then he ate and rested, all in one go. After he had rested enough, he drank a mouthful of kettle apple juice and began his experiment. The experiment of sure kill skill, drinking milk, was already at a relatively perfect stage. After a few days, he suddenly had some new insights about some of the details. Now it was easier to restart the experiment. Tonight, the first sure kill skill, drinking milk, only took half an hour to refine, and the completion rate was better than before. However, he didn't rush to fast forward. Instead, after refining this one, he compared it with the recorded experimental data to find the differences, distinguish the optimized parts, and record them down. For this kind of experiment that needed to be repeated many times to optimize, the recording of data was very important. In the subsequent experiments, he kept the optimized parts on the basis of further filling in the gaps and looking for a better solution. If it failed, he reflected and corrected it. If it succeeded, he compared it with the extraction and continued to optimize. Overall, the progress of the experiment was going up, and the completion rate of each one was higher than the previous one. Although he didn't reach the extreme on Friday night, but there was still Saturday and Sunday. If he invested financial, material, and energy, there would be results. 2 in 1. Chapter 288. The entire weekend, Dake was immersed in the research of the Sure Kill skill card. On Sunday afternoon, he finally managed to optimize the Sure Kill skill, drink milk, to close to 100%. The reason why he progressed so quickly was not because he was very strong, but because he had chosen the core materials perfectly. Dake's milkweed could be said to be the mother of the milk can. The milk that was fermented by the kettle pot was one of the core materials for the milk can. The compatibility between the two was unparalleled. In comparison, although the fur of the fantasy beast was relatively compatible with the transformation, the nature of the fantasy beast was constantly changing, so it might not achieve the desired effect. That night, after Dake had made enough Sure Kill skill, drink milk, he put all the Sure Kill skill, drink milk cards into a small backpack. Then, under the expectant gaze of the milk can, he carried the pink backpack on his back. Moo moo moo, the milk can was so excited that it mooed. For the past 2 days, it had been working hard to experiment with the Sure Kill skill, drink milk. Now it was finally paying off. With this backpack full of Sure Kill skill cards, it would be more than enough to walk around the castle. First website, https://m, Vipcanchu. VIP. Finally, after the little demon beast, there was another magic guide elf that could go out and play. Every time it went out, it would have to come back to its master to replenish its magic. Of course, Dake did not find it troublesome. He even custom-made a silver plate with the dimming emblem engraved on it in advance, and reminded the milk can not forget to wear it when it went out. The Shungmalian school rules did not have any restrictions on the movement of magic guide elves. So, at least before the new school rules came out, the milk can move around freely. If it wore the silver plate with the dimming emblem engraved on it, it would be able to move around freely. The other magic guide elves looked at the milk can's small backpack and small plate with envy written all over their faces. Unfortunately, they couldn't use Sure Kill skill, drink milk. The only one with healing skills was Moon Ibu after Ibu-chan used Bliss 3, Moon. Therefore, if they wanted to go out and explore, they could only rely on the milk jug. Fairy Ibu's large eyes spun around like the wheels of a cart. Clearly, he had already begun to think of a deal. The Dilu beast focused its attention on the picture book, indicating that it was not envious at all. Dake rubbed its face against Big Milk Can's cheek, and returned to the lab table with satisfaction. It then began its last experiment of the day. He was going to start refining ultimate skill, transformation. The last strand of fantasy beast hair, the last material for ultimate skill, transformation. It took him an entire hour to complete the experiment. The result of the experiment couldn't be considered a failure, but it was basically within expectations. It could only be said that the completion of this sure kill skill card was still not enough, and the effect of transformation was not ideal. After Dake finished recording the data, he sighed slightly. Refining a sure kill skill card was indeed not that easy. He had been too naive. If he really wanted to learn something, it was not something that could be done through repeated experiments. Theoretical research was also very important. However, if he wanted to have theoretical achievements, he would need Professor Ka-Zayer's guidance. However, Professor Ka-Zayer did not completely study this technology. Therefore, unless he was determined to invest a large amount of time into it, it was better to put aside the research on Ultimate Skill Card. Also, Dake did not want to bite off more than he could chew. He still had a lot of research to do, and it was not good to add another one. He could only postpone it. At 10 o'clock at night, the moon was above the clouds. After Dake finished his underworld spirit spell practice for the day, he went to bed. Ever since he started practicing underworld spirit spell, he rarely had insomnia. He basically fell asleep as soon as he laid down, and the quality of his sleep was surprisingly good. This was probably one of the reasons why he could practice underworld spirit spell for half an hour every day. All in all, he slept very deeply tonight. He did not notice that the little cuties that would crawl into his bed every night were not harmonious during this process. However, tonight the situation in Dorm 201 was slightly different. Fairy Ibu, who was usually the fastest to move, did not move tonight. Only the Dilu beast came down from its small bed, as if it was a matter of course. With a few steps, it squeezed into Dark's bed. After the little fiend beast carefully observed, it also carefully crept in from the other side. Seeing that no one moved, Ibu also crawled in and squeezed with the little fiend beast. These two one-star little cuties gradually learned how to hug each other for warmth. After a while, the two magic guide fairies opened a slit in their blankets, revealing only two pairs of small eyes that looked outside. However, the biggest threat, Fairy Ibu, still did not move. The warmth in the bed gradually grew. The little fiend beast and Ibu's eyelids slowly closed. The night deepened. The breathing in the dorm became even and stable. More magic guide fairies fell asleep. Bada. A soft sound rang out. Two of the small beds moved. Suddenly, a small hoof popped out from one of the small beds. Big Milk Jug got off the bed and looked around carefully. Immediately afterwards, Evie, who was on the other small bed, also lifted her blanket. With a small jump, she silently landed on the plush carpet. The two 4-star magic guide fairies born from bliss looked at each other and quietly slipped to the window where the moonlight slanted in. Although the Milkkin was an ordinary magic guide fairy, its energy compatibility with the fairy element was very good. Because of bliss, it also had a natural fondness for moonlight. Fairy Ibu naturally did not need to be mentioned. The two magic guide fairies enjoyed the gentle caress of the moonlight, and could not help but squint their eyes into crescent moons. After a while, only then did Evie whisper to the milk jug, "Me me yo, me." The Milkkin patted its chest and said, "Moo moo moo moo." Fairy Ibu sat down, raised the meatball, and flicked out a claw. "Me." The Milkkin tilted its head and thought for a moment, then shook its head vigorously and raised two hooves. "Moo." Fairy Ibu could not help but frown, but it gritted its teeth and held on for a while, then slowly flicked out a second claw. "Mio." The Milkkin shook its head firmly. "Mio." Fairy Ibu said angrily and finally stretched out a third claw. Only then did the Milkkin nod in satisfaction and put down its two hooves. Then, Fairy Ibu took out 3 little red flowers from its small cabinet and handed them to the milk can with a pained expression. The Milkkin took the little red flowers and immediately put them into its small cabinet, its face filled with joy. Thus, the two sides reached a deal. Big Milk Jug then carried his little backpack that was stuffed full of sure kill skill, Milk Jug, and quietly moved to the door. When it reached the door and turned its head slightly, it saw that Fairy Ibu was already following behind. Moo. Fairy Ibu curled its lips and stretched out its ribbon to wrap around the door lock. With a light twist, it opened the door. Then it wrapped around the door handle and carefully pulled the door open. A cold wind blew into the room, causing the two magic guiding fairies to shiver slightly. Moo. The milk can blew at the wind and returned to the bedroom. It took out a scarf from the small cabinet and put it on with great care. Fairy Ibu glanced at it, but did not take its scarf. The two magic guiding fairies slipped out of the dormitory, one in front and one behind, for the first time under the bright moon. The milkkin waited outside for a while. Then Fairy Ibu turned around and closed the door. Inside the door, the Dilu beast's ears twitched, then lowered again. Of course they had the key, which was hidden in the milk can's small backpack. The two magic guiding fairies raised their heads slightly and looked towards the empty corridor on the second floor, a trace of confusion flashing through their eyes. Not to mention going out. It was even the first time they had stepped into the corridor outside the door. But not long after, the corners of Fairy Ibu's mouth rose, revealing a trace of uncontrollable excitement. It was just past 11 o'clock, and the students who were going to start class tomorrow had already returned to their dormitories. Compared to the magic guiding fairies' petite bodies, the corridor seemed extra spacious and empty. It was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Looking at the other end of the corridor, the end of the corridor gradually disappeared into the thick darkness, revealing a trace of cold that was hard to find in the daytime. Moo. Big Milk Jug let out a cry. But Fairy Ibu's mood continued to rise. Although it was not the embodiment of the night like the moon fairies, Fairy Ibu was naturally fond of the night of the moon. Carat Omega Carat. The somewhat high-pitched cry penetrated the darkness and touched the end of the corridor, producing a trace of an echo. Fairy Ibu strode forward with its head held high, fearlessly walking forward. The unfamiliar environment stimulated its desire to explore. Its gaze constantly swept over the decorative paintings on the wall, like a noble lord inspecting his own castle. The milk can, who had stopped in place and almost left the group, hurriedly caught up. It grabbed its scarf and stuck closely behind Fairy Ibu, looking left and right. Choosing to go out in the middle of the night for the first time was too exciting for the milk can, who had a conservative personality. But the feeling of breaking out of a rusty framework always made people feel a trace of satisfaction. Not long after, they arrived at the first staircase. Fairy Ibu stopped at the staircase and lowered its head to look at the stairs leading down to the first floor, then raised its head to look at the stairs leading up to the third floor. It couldn't help but tilt its head, its two ribbons swinging in the air. Little me, moo moo moo. The milkkin expressed its desire to go to the top of the tower to take a look. It had once heard the little fiend boast that the tower of the noble house had a total of 9 floors apart from the basement. The 8th floor was the dual practice room, and the 9th floor was the observatory. The observatory was the astronomy of astronomy. Although little Ibu seemed to be very troubled by the astronomy class, the rest of the magic guiding fairies were secretly watching. Being able to go to the astronomy class with its master was a unique treatment. Although the milkkin didn't say anything, it was secretly envious. Moo moo moo. The milkkin called out again, indicating that the observatory also had the legendary telescope. It was their first time going out at night, so it was better to be a bit more conservative and just stroll around the tower. But what it didn't expect was that its very normal suggestion would cause Fairy Evie to rebel. Little me. Fairy Ibu immediately turned around and ran downstairs. Moo. The milkkin paused in place, then hurriedly chased after it. After 11 o'clock, there wasn't a single person in the common lounge. Fairy Ibu had just taken a step when the magic guiding lamp on the wall suddenly lit up. It was so scared that it subconsciously stopped and was hit by the milk can, who couldn't stop in time. The two magic guiding fairies took a few steps forward and entered the common lounge. Following the activation of the magic guiding lamp, the magic flames in the stronghold suddenly ignited. But Fairy Ibu wasn't that scared anymore. It looked around and cautiously approached the fireplace. The light reflected by the flames licked its cheeks, making it inexplicably excited. Little me. It repeatedly jumped around the fireplace twice, then propped up its body and turned around twice. Behind it, the milk can was squatting on the ground, stretching out its forelimbs to feel the heat emitted by the fireplace, its expression soft. It had seen the fireplace from reading books, but this was the first time it had seen it, and felt it for itself. Everything in the outside world was really full of novelty. It was really lucky to be able to become its master's magic guiding fairy. If Fairy Ibu wasn't here, it would probably be able to stay in front of this fireplace for an entire night. Of course, the Surekill skill card in its little pink school bag might not be able to last that long. It thought this way. The milkkin stretched out its hand and rubbed out a bottle of milk, then took out a Surekill skill card from its little school bag. It didn't learn the usual summoning spell, but Dake did an experiment after successfully refining it, and found that the milkkin didn't need the usual summoning spell to activate the Surekill skill. Drink milk. All it needed to do was to inject magic into it. Although the inject magic into it part wasn't something that ordinary magic guiding fairies could do. But there was no doubt that it was a big discovery. There seemed to be a special connection between the magic guiding fairy and the Surekill skill card extracted from the magic guiding fairy. This made it so that the magic guiding fairy didn't need the usual summoning spell to activate it. Of course, because there was only one sample of the reference, the above guess was just a guess. Or maybe the milkkin was a little more special, or maybe the Surekill skill. Drink milk was a little more special. After all, the milkkin was a gold card. And the Surekill skill, drink milk, was its core skill. In short, after using the Surekill skill, drink milk, another bottle of milk appeared in the milkcan's hands. It handed this bottle of milk to Fairy Ibu, then opened the seal of the milk bottle with it, hugging the milk bottle and drinking it. As the milk entered its mouth, the warm current produced by the milk spread throughout its body, and the two magic guiding fairies lasted for another 4 minutes. Moo. Big Milkkin reminded him. Fairy Ibu drank the last mouthful of milk, licked the corner of its mouth that had turned white, and led the way to the gate of the aristocrat house's tower. Pushing open the gate, there was a bigger world waiting for them. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.